About 10 years ago, I was in a bar in Union Square. They were hosting a video game night, and the entire room was filled with monitors, each of them playing a different game from a different console and a different genre. There was a ton of variety. I spent the night playing Power Stone, Mario Kart, Nidhogg, a bunch of classics, and some personal favorites. However, as the night went on, I had thought. Every game there was one that I had played many times over, and it made me want something new. I started to miss the arcade days where I could just walk into one and suddenly there'd be some brand new title that I had never heard of and it would blow my mind and become an instant favorite. And it had been a while since I had gotten that feeling. Well, as I sat at the bar drinking my rum and coke minus the rum, suddenly the screen on the wall switched to a different game. It was a fighting game. And I had no idea what it was. There was some blonde kid with a sword fighting a tall, lanky monster in a moonlit urban environment. It had a style that was fashionable, modern, totally different from anything else out there. It was using sprites that were nostalgic, but they were so crisp and clean that they felt brand new. It was fast-paced and yet still simple enough for me to follow. The music was... Actually, I have no idea what the music was like. I was in a bar. There were like 200 people talking in there. I couldn't hear a thing, but it was probably cool too. I spent the rest of the night searching for what game this was, what console it was on, but nobody knew. And so for years, this became my Cinderella game. I kept trying to track it down, remember names of characters or things that I could describe about, but sadly, if you just type blonde kid with a sword stain in a parking lot into a Google search, it's not as helpful as you might think. But after years, I finally found it, and what I found was a title with some of the most accessible combat out there, while having nearly unlimited potential. One of the best soundtracks in the entire genre, a cast of characters that were instantly memorable, and a dedicated player base that has built this game up from obscure cult classic into a main stage champ. So grab your insulators, charge up your grids, and get ready to go Vorpal as I explain to you what the hell any of that just meant. This is the Under Night in Birth Retrospective. Welcome, World Warriors, to Part 8 of the Street Fighter Retrospective. In this part, we're going to be looking at all the brand new characters who have been added in Season 3. All 2 of them, and whoa, wait, stop, hold up, back up, sorry, that's on me, everybody, my mistake. You know when you, do one retrospective over the course of 2 years, talking about one franchise, you kind of just get into a pattern. Let's try that again, shall we? Welcome to another episode of the Fighting Game Retrospective. And in this one, we're going to be tackling a game that I have been wanting to talk about for a while. Under Night in Birth is a series that's been steadily growing within the FGC for the past decade, has a look and style that's all its own, and has so many unique mechanics that make it stand out from other fighters. And yet, I'd be willing to say that this still remains a title that most players know nothing about. But before we begin, I want to say I'm going to be referencing a lot of interviews and articles in this video, and I'll be linking them in the description down below, but I want to go ahead and give a special shout out to the independent In-Birth Wiki. Because when I said that I was doing an Undernight retrospective, the person who runs that wiki reached out to me and said, hey, I've got a bunch of interviews that might be helpful, and I appreciate that. So shout out to them, and I'll make sure to link their wiki in the description down below as well. Now, to understand the story of Undernight In-Birth, we must first learn the story of French bread. Not that one.
You tap them out, they prove you wrong, but Terry with the if nobody got me, I know my Neko Arc homies got me, can I get an amen?
That one. Yes, Undernight In-Birth is the original title from developer Soft Circle French Bread, and French Bread was founded by Nobuya Narita. When Narita was a student, he loved fighting games, especially from Capcom and SNK, and he dreamed of growing up to be a fighting game developer. So after graduating college, he was hired by a game company. A game company that went bankrupt in less than a year. So he now found himself out of work, and he realized he had two paths before him. Search for another studio to work for and hope that turned out better this time, or give up on his dream. But thankfully, Narita chose the third option. He said, screw it, I'm going to do it myself. So he gathered up several other developers who had also just been fired from that same studio, then called up a friend of his who had been part of a doujin circle since the 80s, and turned that group into Watanabe Productions. Now, in case you're like me 6 months ago and you have no idea what a doujin circle is, it's essentially a Japanese term for a group of developers and artists who come together to create low-budget projects that are typically defined by their passion and are often fan works using characters from pre-established sources. In the mid-90s and early 2000s, Japan was seeing a boom in doujin games, also called doujin soft. Watanabe Productions would put out their first game in 1998, Queen of Hearts 98, based on the visual novel Two Heart and using combat that was heavily influenced by multiple games, including a dash of King of Fighters, as you can probably tell from the giant 98 in the title, and a heaping helping of Asuka 120%, which might have had something to do with the fact that some of the members of Watanabe Productions had actually worked for Asuka 120's developer Phil and Cafe right before they shut down the same year. So in other words, if you were a fighting game developer whose studio got shut down, Watanabe Productions was going to collect you like a Pokemon. Now, if you've never heard of Asuka 120%, it's a rather niche game even among niche fighting game fans, but the impact it has left is rather large. Many people credit it as being one of the founding fathers of the quote-unquote anime fighter genre, as it introduced mechanics like clashing, gatling, and much more. If you want to know more about the history of Asuka 120, then I highly recommend checking out Gal Winquote's video on this subject, which I'll be linking in the card here. Queen of Hearts 98 ended up blowing up, selling over 100,000 copies, which for a doujin game was massive. And so, Watanabe Productions took off and would spend the next several years launching multiple doujin games, with arguably their biggest success being Glove on Fight, a play on the Atlas fighting game Groove on Fight, featuring really charming chibi sprites and a cast of characters from various other doujin games and animes. However, even though their doujin ventures had been successful, Narita knew it couldn't last. In an interview with French website Boss Grosbean, Narita said, quote, Watanabe was a doujin circle that did everything and anything, including things we prefer not to mention anymore. We really went in all directions at once, and the circle had grown way too much. We thought that we might run into issues if we kept going that way. Well, that doesn't sound good. Yeah, I read a lot of interviews with Narita, and he comes off as a very cheerful, friendly person, but the moment that he gets asked about Watanabe Productions, he gets quiet quick. And there might be a reason for that. It's because doujin games don't tend to be... What's the word that I'm looking for here? Alright, legal. Yeah, you might have heard me mention that Watanabe was making games using existing series and characters, and you probably thought, oh wow, how did this little studio get permission to use those characters? That's the fun part. They didn't. Yeah, because so many doujins tend to be fan projects, they often reside within that legal gray area. And in all honesty, most companies are either cool with doujins existing of their properties, or they don't think it's worth the time and energy to pursue legal action. However, that does not change the fact that they could pursue legal actions whenever they want to, and the moment you start selling those doujins, that gray area gets a little bit darker. Oftentimes, these doujin projects can only be sold at special conventions that are made just for them, or through smaller personal channels that are a bit more under the table. And because of that, no matter how popular these games were, Watanabe Productions still had to be pretty hush-hush about them. Even to this day, Narita can't say too much. In an interview with 4Gamer, Narita was asked about Queen of Hearts, and in the most ominous way possible, replied, "Ah! Let's not talk about that." There were so many things that happened, and we caused a lot of trouble in all directions. Well, it's rare that we start one of these retrospectives with legal troubles. Normally, that's the third act twist. So after several years, the team at Watanabe Productions realized they couldn't stay in the doujin sphere much longer. Partly because of the whole legal issues. It's a great game to make games with your friends, but when you have to slide those games to your customers underneath a newspaper asking them if they're a cop, then yeah, I'd imagine that would wear on your psyche. And the larger Watanabe grew, the more eyes they got on them, and the more they realized the dangers of turning this into their career. In that interview with 4Gamer, Narita said, quote, "Our doujin fanfiction activities became a bigger topic than we expected, and we ended up causing a lot of trouble for the various publishers who were the sources of the material. This made us realize the dangers of staying in the doujin field, inside the world of fanfiction." Well, along their career in the doujin sphere, Watanabe Productions would meet the team at Type Moon. Now, if that name sounds familiar, it's because Type Moon would one day go on to create the Fate series, a juggernaut in the world of visual novels, which Type Moon is still producing material for today. But at this point, Type Moon was just another doujin circle, and they had recently created their own original visual novel, Tsukihime. This series would blow up for Type Moon, going on to get multiple installments and even an anime, so Watanabe Productions approached them with the idea of creating a fighting game for the series. This led to the creation of Melty Blood, which was the game that put Watanabe Productions on the map. By the way, for everyone who's been asking me for a Melty Blood retrospective, as soon as I can find a way to play and record the first two PC-only versions of that game, then yes, absolutely. But that's proving to be a little bit difficult. So Watanabe spent the next several years working on Melty Blood, updating the series with multiple installments, and even changing their name from Watanabe Productions to Soft Circle French Bread. Now, the Soft Circle part is a reference to their doujin origins, but as for the French Bread part, according to future team member Kamone Sarazawa, they chose that name because when they started this company, they were all so broke, the only thing they could afford was tap water and convenience store French bread. This team has instantly become the most relatable developers I've ever had to cover on this show. But looks like their days of struggling to survive were finally over. Melty Blood was a big hit, but more importantly, it was a hit that they could sell. Because they were officially licensing this game with Type Moon, that means that they could put this game out in stores. They could actually make money on it through official channels. And so for years, French Bread kept making updated versions of this game, with each installment bringing in brand new players and letting the fan base grow larger and larger. Up until a point. You see, as popular as Melty Blood was, there was something that it couldn't compete with. Time. As the years ticked on and new console generations were on the horizon, French Bread realized that graphics in games were about to take a huge leap. And not only was Melty Blood now starting to look a bit old, it was also starting to look a bit square. Yeah, games were about to go from 4:3 to 16:9 ratios, meaning if French Bread wanted to keep making Melty Blood, they couldn't just update it again. They would now have to create a completely new installment. But therein lies the next problem. They had no idea what to do for a new installment. Not in terms of gameplay, but in terms of the plot. According to Narita, quote, "The current Melty Blood game's story had become too cluttered due to years of expansions and renovations, so we needed to sort out how to create a sequel." So Narita reached out to Tsukihime's original author, Kinoko Nasu, to ask for help in crafting the sequel to this game. Unfortunately, Nasu was currently too busy with their brand new visual novel, Witch of the Holy Night, and they just didn't have time to help French Bread's team. So French Bread now found themselves in need of a brand new game, and they needed it quick. Yeah, I said Melty Blood was a success, but was a success on the scale of a niche arcade fighter in the early 2000s. It kept the lights on, but it didn't give them much of a safety net. So they started looking around for new studios that wanted to turn their properties into fighting games, but nobody was willing to answer that call. So things were looking grim for French Bread. The game that kept them going for half a decade was coming to an end, and they had no jobs on the horizon. But that's when they got the crazy idea, if nobody was willing to hire them, what if they just made their own game? It sounds obvious, but believe it or not, making your own original game, not that easy. Not only would they have to come up with everything on their own, but this would also be a huge financial risk for the company. Melty Blood came with a built-in audience, but if they made their own game, there was nobody there to catch them if they fell. But with no other options, the team came together and decided to take their biggest gamble yet, as they began production on a completely original title. But first, they were going to need an idea. And luckily, designer Seiichi Yoshihara had been waiting for this exact moment, because he had been building up a story in his head ever since high school. He'd already envisioned a whole world full of multiple characters and a deep lore. The initial pitch for this game, which came to be known as Void Red, was about another world beyond what we can see and feel. It would take place in a sci-fi fantasy setting where two races, known as the Worths and Worthlesses, had been at war with each other. The plot largely revolved around a young girl named Lene who had been cursed with the power of resurrection. Lene was found and rescued by a man named Hyde, and over the course of years, he would raise her to use her powers to fight the Worths. This was a rich, detailed setting that Yoshihara had dreamed up. There was just one problem with it. Nobody knew what the hell Yoshihara was talking about. Yet Narita said nobody at the studio really understood this initial pitch because it was too complicated and hard to explain. I'd like to remind you all, this was the team that spent the better part of a decade working on Melty Blood. But confusing or not, they at least had a premise. Unfortunately, they still didn't have a ton of, to put bluntly, experience. Not when it came to making fighting games, no, they've been doing that for years. Although the quality of those games, yeah, let's put a pin in that for now. But each of those fighters used designs and characters and stories all based on other sources, so crafting all that completely from the ground up was a whole new ballgame. They needed help, someone who could give them guidance, and luckily, Narita had a connection. He had a friend who worked at Arc System Works, and he got Narita in touch with Toshimichi Mori, aka Mori P, aka the guy who made BlazBlue. And Narita and Mori P couldn't have been more different. I mean, just look at them. Mori P comes with his own built-in aura. Narita looks like he's just happy to be there. But Mori P stepped up and agreed to help out this inexperienced team, and he didn't hold back. He put them through character creator boot camp. In a Famitsu interview, Narita was asked about Mori P, and he says the two of them used to meet up at a bar, and he would give Mori a status report, at which point he would, quote, "Listen to Mori trashing all of our ideas." And he said that right in front of Mori. Mori was there for the interview, by the way. But trashing them or not, apparently Mori's guidance was exactly what this game needed. He gave them advice on the unique mechanics of the game, balance adjustments, and of course, the story. Narita and the rest of French Bread knew that Yoshihara's idea for the plot wasn't quite right. They needed some help clearing it all up. Which raises an important question. How complicated was your plot that you needed the guy who made BlazBlue to simplify it? That game required a pre-existing knowledge of quantum physics to understand it. They showed Mori the sketch of Hyde, who at this point was meant to be an older, jaded Guardian character, and Mori just said, quote, "Make him look more like a protagonist." And with that one simple bit of advice, the whole game changed. Not only did they make Hyde the new protagonist, but they had to ask, what kind of a protagonist would he be? And they realized, why don't we just write what we know? We spent years in the world of visual novels and light novels. Let's start there. So they made Hyde a high schooler and swapped the setting from a far-off magical sci-fi setting to the modern-day real world. The team began describing this game as a, quote, light novel fighting game. And before I go any further, yes, I am aware that there's a running gag on this channel that I constantly mix up light novels and visual novels. But Narita himself kept referring to this as a light novel fighting game in multiple interviews, so you know what? If I screwed up in this video, it ain't on me this time, okay? I am just the messenger on this one. But they also decided to change the tone of the story. Originally, this game was going to be more sword and sorcery with techno-futurism and a dash of lone wolf and cub, sort of just every cool idea that Yoshihara had all thrown into a big pot. In other words, every story that we all wrote back in high school. But now the game was going to focus more on a chunibyo style. Chunibyo is a Japanese term that, to put it simply, is about rebellious youth and power fantasies. It's often used to describe kids who dream of having powers to take on the world. Trust me, even if you haven't heard this term before, you've definitely seen animes and games that have this spirit. And I'm making sure to bring this up because the French Bread team would mention this style in many interviews. It was very much the intended tone, and you can definitely see it in the final product. They also greatly overhauled the design of the characters, making them much simpler to match the real-world setting. And also because, according to Narita, working with HD graphics was proving far more difficult than they expected. In fact, Narita was so nervous about moving to HD graphics, he even wondered if they should attempt it at all, and Yoshihara had to convince him that no, this was the future. If we want to create brand new video games, we have to move forward. It feels so weird in 2026 thinking about how people used to be nervous about a concept like 720p. But that wasn't the only thing that Narita was nervous about. After a lifetime of creating works based on other people's projects, French Bread was about to release their own original game, and Narita didn't think it would sell. Narita once said that when he was younger, he liked working in the doujin circles because his team had tried making their own original games before, and they flopped. In fact, they sold so poorly that Narita told 4Gamer, quote, "We were conditioned to think that original works was synonymous with not selling." Yet his team had failed so hard, they didn't even think there was a point in trying to create their own games. And so, a part of him wanted to stay in the doujin circles because creating works based on something that was already a success gave them a layer of protection. It felt safe. But eventually, Narita realized that's not how he wanted this company to operate anymore. That's not what he wanted to keep doing. He said there came a point where thinking about continuing to work on other people's characters and stories filled him with anxiety because it made him think, quote, "In a few years, I'll have nothing left. Before you know it, you completely lose the know-how to create something from scratch, and you become stuck." So as scary as that was, in 2012, French Bread took that leap. They released a game that was completely original, and the rest of the world would now enter the Hollow Knight. Under Night in Birth hit arcades in September of 2012, although if you've never seen an Under Night cabinet in the wild, that's because it was released on Sega's AltNet PRAS multi-cabinet, which might be the biggest word salad I've ever read off on this show. This was an arcade cabinet that was designed to hold multiple titles that players could select between, but they'd also be digital with access to the internet, allowing the developers to patch in updates as they were needed, and when it came to the original version of Under Night, those updates were indeed needed. You'll get what I mean in a second, but for now, let's talk about what exactly is the story of Under Night. Yeah, we talked plenty about what the original premise was, but after changing all the characters around and changing the tone and the setting and everything else from top to bottom, what exactly did they end up with? So the premise of this game is that once a month, under a full moon, the border between this world and another is weakened, and a mysterious boundary appears known as the Hollow Knight, often just shortened to the Night. Think of it as a tiny pocket dimension that forms in the real world, but only certain people can see and interact with it. The Night could form right around you and you'd never even notice it, but you could turn around and see that your friend is gone because they're now stuck in the Shadow Realm. When you're inside the Night, everything looks exactly the same, except everyone from the outside world is gone, and it's crawling with voids. Voids are dark, shadowy figures from another reality, but when the Night appears, their reality bleeds into ours. Voids are beastly creatures that can take on many different forms. The weakest of them appear to be just black blobs, but the stronger a void gets, the more its body starts to resemble a human. Now, voids feed on something called Exes, spelled E-X-S. This is essentially the energy of existence, hence the name. It's present in all matter, it's what all life comes from. It's kind of like Chi, Hamon, Nin, Reishi. If you've played enough games, watched enough animes or movies, you're familiar with the concept. So if a human finds themselves in the Night, voids will try to eat their Exes. However, if you manage to survive a void taking a bite out of your soul and your mind doesn't shatter from the pressure of it, then you'll gain the void's power to manipulate Exes. This means you'll be faster, stronger, and your Exes can even take on the form of a weapon. Think of it like Bleach if being bitten by a hollow turned you into a Shinigami. That ain't even the only Bleach reference I'm going to make in this video, so apologies to anyone who hasn't seen it. And humans who have gained the power to manipulate Exes are known as inbirths. And yes, people have made plenty of jokes about that name, and I will gladly admit it is weird. But when you learn the lore, it actually kind of makes sense. Essentially, if you get attacked by a void and you have your soul ripped apart, When you awaken, you're considered a new being. A being that wasn't born. So, you're called a falseborn, with in-birth being an abbreviated way of saying that. Yes, there are multiple names for the same thing in this game. Did I mention Maury P. helped them to write this premise? Now, there's about a dozen other rules surrounding in-births, but the two big ones that you need to know is that if you use your powers too much, then your excess can consume your body and turn you into a void. But if you don't use your powers enough, then you can lose those powers and you'll return to being a normal human. Now, in case you think this story is too confusing so far, get ready because now we're flashing back 500 years. Here, a small village in Japan helped out a stranger, and to repay their kindness, this stranger showed them his powers. This man, who would later be known as the Hollow God, taught this village about Exus and showed them how to manipulate this energy. Unfortunately, the neighboring village became afraid of their powers, so they attacked. The village then formed a defensive squad known as the Nightblades to defend themselves from outsiders. But this drew the attention of a German squad of in-births known as the Lichtkreis. The Lichtkreis and the Nightblades went to war with each other, only ending when the leader of the Nightblades, Kuon, saved the injured leader of Lichtkreis, Waldstein. Afterwards, the elder of the Nightblades decided to take the seal with all the knowledge of Exus and split in two, putting one half of the seal in Kuon and the other half in his sister Lene. Both of them would be granted immortality, Kuon becoming a walking curse, a ghost of a human being, whereas Lene's immortality would take the form of continuous resurrection. Anytime she died, she would be reborn as a child. Now, cut to present day, and there are four main groups involved in our story. There's the Nightblades, except now they're no longer a unified force, they're now more of individuals across the world who enter the Hollow Knight to fight voids on their own terms. If they feel like it. Yeah, there's only like 100 Nightblades left, and most of them are effectively retired. They're not the lean, mean fighting force that they once were. Then there's the Lichtkreis, which is still going strong, except that after the battle with the Nightblades 500 years ago, their strongest warrior Waldstein quit because he felt that he owed Kuon a debt. Well, since Waldstein was kind of an item with Lichtkreis' leader, Adelheid, she became so offended by this, she banned all men from serving in this squad. Now cut to the present, and Adelheid has sent a handful of agents over to Japan because she's gotten word that something might be going down with the upcoming night, and she wants them to investigate. Now, the third group isn't really a group, it's the random in-birth individuals who enter the night. This is the big X factor because everyone who gets turned into an in-birth has some kind of a goal, something that keeps them coming back and fighting inside the night. Maybe they're looking for revenge, maybe they're searching for a friend, maybe they're just insane and enjoy getting to go wild with these brand new powers of theirs. But that brings us to the final group, the big villain team of the game, Amnesia. This is essentially a gang of in-births who are seeking to rule over the night, and they're not the only ones. Remember how I said they wanted to give this game a Chunibyo style? That rebellious tone of dreaming of having powers and running wild with them? Yeah, that's kind of what the night turns into. A lot of people who become in-births love the idea of going into the night and fighting to take control, essentially turning this pocket dimension into a giant battle royale each month. And so, numerous in-births have started to come together to form gangs, dividing the city up and fighting to take control of it. And Amnesia is the current top dogs. I gotta say, Amnesia might be my favorite villain group in any fighting game because, sure, they are bad guys, but they also just kind of feel like normal people. They hang out in a bar, they just have normal conversations, they even feel like friends to each other. I can't really say that about any other villain group in a fighting game. You think anybody in Shaolu cares about each other? I don't even think Bison knew Vega's name. That joke had like 3 different layers to it. Now, in the previous night, Amnesia got into a fight with the last remaining rival gang, Bongikai, and Amnesia's leader Hilda was so powerful that the rival leader Ogre couldn't stand up to her. However, at the center of each night is a collection of endless Exes called the Abyss, which is said to be able to grant in-births incredible boost in power. Yes, at the center of this otherworldly dimension is a collection of the big MacGuffin energy that gives you unlimited power. Again, can you tell that Maury P. helped them to craft this story? One member of Amnesia, Roger, got too close to the Abyss and his body couldn't handle the rush of Exes, and it turned him into a void. The Abyss continued to grow and it looked like there was no way to stop it, so Ogre jumped into it and sacrificed himself to make sure the Abyss would close. Well, Hilda, whose arrogance knows no bounds, said, "Oh, Roger got turned into a void by getting too close to the Abyss? Well, that's a shame. Luckily, I'm just built different." So now the new night has rolled around, and Hilda decides she's going to go to the center of the Hollow Knight, to the Abyss, and absorb its power, turning her into a rebirth, the most powerful form of an in-birth, essentially making her a god. And that is where our story begins. And I mean that quite literally. The game just starts in the middle of all this. In the original release of this game, there's no story or prequel or anything that explains the plot to you. It wasn't until the second home release that they finally added a story mode that told you what was happening. Before that, you just picked a character and they started their arcade mode by saying, well, I guess I have to get to the center of the night to stop Hilda. Great! Who is that and what is that? French Bread said they wanted to make this game feel like a light novel fighting game. Except they forgot to make the light novel this game would be based on. But that does serve as a good segue to our cast of characters. In the initial arcade release, there were 12 fighters. First up on the side of the Nightblades, there's Lene. We already talked about her in the backstory. She's considered the princess of the Nightblades and is looking for a way to end her cycle of rebirth. Gameplay-wise, she is one of the quickest characters in the game, insanely agile and is capable of jumping and leaping all over the stage. Also, as you may have noticed, she's got a tiny dragon that follows her around named Ku. Ku is a void that her brother Kuon commanded to follow Lene around and guard her. That's it. Yeah, Ku never comes up in her gameplay, and in all honesty, doesn't even really come up that much in the story. However, Ku has been turned into kind of the mascot of Under Night, so it is worth bringing up. Then there's the other half of our protagonist duo, Hyde. Hyde on the surface is your typical rebellious youth, but underneath all that, he's actually pretty responsible and caring. He even ended up meeting Lene when he thought she was just a normal girl in danger and then walked her home to make sure that she was okay, only to then end up walking into the night and getting attacked by a void. He gained the power to summon out a sword, but not just any sword. The legendary Insulator Sword. This was a sword that was originally given to Lene's brother Kuon 500 years ago by an ancient robot angel. We'll get to that soon, don't worry. Why does Hyde have this sword? It's not really explained, but Lene knows that Hyde is in way over his head, and the Insulator could have the power to destroy the seal inside of her, ending her eternal cycle of rebirth. And so she begins to train him. Real big Rukia and Ichigo vibes coming off these two. Now, fun fact, Insulator is the name of Hyde's weapon. In fact, every character's weapon in here has its own name. But their unique X's power also has its own name. And the name of Hyde's power? Void Red. A nice little reference back to the original pitch of this game. Hyde's sword gives him pretty decent normals. He's got fairly average speed, pretty good strength. He's got a few projectiles. As you might expect, he's your typical Protag style character. Your all-rounder. Next up is Waldstein. Remember him from the backstory? He used to be the strongest fighter of the Lich Christ, but during his fight with Kuon, his X's powers overwhelmed him and he almost transformed into a void. But he was saved by Kuon himself, so he swore to repay this debt to his brand new friends. He spent the last 500 years protecting Lene as her giant hulking guardian, but even after all these years, his biggest obsession is battle. He still lives for the struggle of a life and death fight and keeps going out into the Hollow Night hoping to find that. Now at this point you might be wondering, hold on, I know you said that Lene is still alive after 500 years because she was given the gift of immortality. How is Waldstein still alive? In fact, for that matter, didn't you say that Adelheid, his old boss over at Lich Christ, is also still alive? We'll get into this a little bit later in the story, but essentially, in-birth's bodies don't work the same way as human bodies. Their bodies are essentially vessels at this point to contain their powers, so as long as they're strong enough, they won't be immortal, but they can just keep going. So to put it simply, Lene isn't immortal because if she dies, she'll just come right back. Waldstein is not immortal, he just lives a long time, but someone could actually kill him. However, as you can tell by looking at him, that's going to be easier said than done. With that massive size and those big meaty claws, he is of course the grappler for the game. He's slow, hits like a truck, and loves to pick you up and throw you back down. Then the final member of the Nightblades, Seth. Seth, despite only being a teenager, is an assassin for the Nightblades and is maybe the most jaded character in this roster. He is the classic tortured bad boy of the game. He's also the rival to Hyde because Seth swore that he would be the one to free Lene from her tortured existence. But to do that, he needs the Insulator, and Hyde kinda has that thing fused to his soul. Seth is the big rushdown character of the game. I know I said that Lene was quick, Seth puts her to shame. He is zipping all over the screen, and if you are having a hard time keeping track of him, just wait until he starts placing orbs on the stage that fire out after a set amount of time, forcing you to split your attention between multiple sources, and considering the fact that Seth moves so fast he already feels like he's in two places at once, that is definitely going to be a challenge. Next up is Yuzuriha. Hundreds of years ago, her family was allies with the Nightblades, but after they started to fight with the Lich Christ, her family said, "Y'all are both crazy, we're out." Now in the present, Yuzuriha has inherited her family's sword and the ability to manipulate X's, along with their mission to fight voids. But she doesn't really want to. Yeah, Yuzuriha is an upbeat girl who loves partying, fashion, basically all the joys of the modern world. She'd far rather go out dancing than slaying monsters. In fact, when she walks, you can even see little musical notes fluttering out of her. I love that. It's such a good little bit of animation. She's also childhood friends with Hyde, but the two of them drifted apart after the incident. What is the incident? Beats me. Yeah, it's never explained. Also, spoiler alert, get ready to hear that a lot. But just because Yuzuriha doesn't want to fight doesn't mean she can't. Her playstyle is all about quick, long-reaching sword slashes. Once she starts slicing you up, she can just keep doing it over and over. Next is the only member of Lich Christ in the starting roster, Orie. She's a very kind, proper girl, but she is 100% dedicated to her mission to destroy voids, which is understandable. A void ate her parents 10 years ago. She's been living in Japan for the past year, going undercover as a student at Hyde's school because the Lich Christ believes that the villain group Amnesia is making a power grab and she needs to investigate. Orie has the power to summon out a giant Stan-like creature called Thanatos. Although considering the name and the premise of these games, I guess it'd be more fitting to call it a persona. It's a giant humanoid-like figure that she can summon out to fight beside her, and that translates to her being sort of like half a puppet fighter? Yeah, Orie definitely gives me that feeling like at some stage of development they were meant to be a puppet fighter. In fact, there's some behind the scenes stuff we'll talk about soon that definitely backs that up, but that certainly isn't what they are in the actual game. Thanatos is not a separate character that you control alongside Orie. They're more of like an assist in a tag game. Orie runs in, does her combo, then has Thanatos pop in and do an attack, and then Orie can continue hitting the opponent afterwards. Next, we're going to be covering the random solo fighters who have found their way into the Hollow Knight, starting with Carmine. Carmine's past is unknown and he doesn't want to share it. All he cares about is ripping and tearing until it is done. He has a wicked bloodlust and enjoys going into the Hollow Knight to challenge the various gangs who are fighting for dominance. He's sadistic and loves nothing more than making his opponents scream for mercy. He fights with his own blood that he can harden into weapons, making him one of the deadliest inverts to emerge. But because he's literally ripping his own body apart in order to use his powers, it does come at a cost. Translation, Carmine is our glass cannon. He does big damage, but at the cost of his own life. But make no mistake, a lot of other glass cannon characters tend to be kind of unga-bunga, just hit buttons and go in. Carmine is not that. Carmine is a very big brain character. He is a mix-up and okie god. Pro players know how to just dominate the entire screen with Carmine attacks, and then the moment the opponent gets knocked down, Carmine's going to start leaving so many traps underneath them that as soon as they get back up again, they are immediately on the defensive again. Then remember how I said that the voids mostly appear as blobby, oozy monsters, but the stronger they get, the more humanoid they appear? Well, say hello to Merkava. He's a void who seeks to devour strong Exus users, but unlike other voids, he can actually communicate. He has the power to telepathically talk to humans, and he's actually very well spoken. Don't get me wrong, end of the day, he still wants to eat you, but he can pontificate and philosophize a bit before he does it. This leads many people to ask the question, is Merkava a void that gained intelligence, or was he a human who turned into a void who still has a few shreds of his mind still intact? I love the way that Merkava plays. His big long arms give him huge range, and his attacks are so easy to combo together. Also, most of his supers involve him swinging his big, wacky, inflatable tube arms around like he's in front of a car dealership, and I don't care who you are, that's just fun. Just look at him. You can't feel bad looking at that super move. Next, remember when I brought up the whole robot angel thing? Well, she's here too. Long ago, back before the Nightblades and the Lich Christ, a group of robotic angel-like figures were created to observe the Hollow Knight. Who made these angels and how? Don't worry, it's never explained. But during the fight between Kuon and Waldstein, one of these angels appeared and gave Kuon the Insulator Sword. Well, now all these years later, that robot has reawakened and it's ready to continue its mission to keep the Knight, lowercase, safe from the Night, uppercase. This is Batista, and she is a charge character, and she might be the chargiest charge character to ever charge. Most charge characters have moves where you hold back and then you press forward and a button, or you hold down and then press up and a button. Well, not only does Batista have those moves, she's one of the only charge characters I've ever seen where she has a move where you hold forward and then press back and attack, and a move where you hold up and then press down and attack. As we will soon discuss, the team at French Bread were really, let's say, experimental on this game. Next up is Eltnum, a mysterious visitor from another world. That world? Melty Blood. Yeah, this is literally just the character Sion from Melty Blood using her middle name. I mentioned that French Bread was going to try and do a Melty Blood game with HD graphics, but for various reasons they had to cancel it. Well, they still managed to make some test sprites for the character Sion, and they just decided, you know what? Screw it, we got the sprites ready to go, why not just put her in the game? They of course got permission from Type Moon to include her, they didn't just shove her in there without telling anyone. No, this was all official. And her moveset is essentially the same from Melty Blood, including giving her guns with reloading ammo, and they even gave her Melty Blood style aerial throws. As for her story, I love that they didn't even try and hide who she is. She spends the entire time breaking the fourth wall and complaining about having to be in this dumb game. And why doesn't my series have a new game? All you guys suck. You're not as cool as the characters from my game. It's actually kind of hilarious. They even bring up some of the busted stuff about Melty Blood in here, and I do love when a game can crack jokes at itself. And that brings us to our final two characters, both members of the villain group Amnesia. There's Gordeau, who is considered to be one of the strongest inverts. Although, despite working for the bad guys, Gordeau is actually super chill. He's a good-natured, laid-back bartender, he's always cracking jokes, and he'll gladly shoot the breeze with anyone. Even if you're his mortal enemy, he'll still have a drink with you. But that all changed the night that Amnesia fought Ogre and his gang, because that was the night that Roger died, and he's blamed himself for it ever since. So even though he's part of Hilda's team, he's still trying to stop her because he doesn't want to see her get consumed and turn into a void as well. Like I said, I really like that we have a villain group in a fighting game that actually cares about each other. Gordeau is a fan favorite character. Everybody loves this guy. Unless you have to fight against him, then everybody hates him. Yeah, in almost every version of Under Night, Gordeau is considered really strong because he spins that scythe all over the screen, making him feel impossible to approach. Also, something that I haven't mentioned yet, each invert's powers are based on an element, or an emotion, or a concept, typically some kind of a non-tangible force. And Gordeau's power is greed. And I'm bringing that up because if he hits you with a standing raw scythe attack, he'll actually steal some of your meter. No, not that meter, the other meter. Yes, there is another meter, we'll get to that soon. But first, there's one more character, the boss of the game, Hilda. I said everyone in Amnesia cares about each other, and that's true for Hilda as well. She definitely cares about her team, but not as much as she cares about power. Hilda is self-centered, stuck up, and thinks that she deserves all the finer things in life, and by finer things, I mean unlimited godlike powers. Hilda definitely deserves her spot as the final boss, because she isn't just a zoner, she is the zoner. She fills the screen with spikes and spinning blades, and if you somehow manage to get past all that, she can just teleport away and force you to go through that all over again. Now, I know I spent a lot of time on the story and those characters, but there's a reason for that. The team at French Bread really cared about them. When asked what he prioritized the most when creating this game, Narita said he grew up with Fatal Fury, so it was all about the characters. If you've heard us talk about SNK before, you know that company was famous for how much lore they gave their fighters, and that definitely rubbed up on Narita when putting this game together. In fact, Narita even said, quote, "As long as the presentation is interesting, the balance doesn't matter." A pretty bold statement for a fighting game dev to make, which might explain why the initial arcade release of this game was shockingly broken. The original arcade release of Under Night was infamous for how many issues it had, and by issues, I mean every single character had an infinite. And not even infinites that would kill you, because normal attacks in this game did big damage, so to balance that out, they made the damage scaling high. So once you got your infinite going, after a few hits, you'd stop doing damage. So players would literally beat each other by getting them in a 90-second long infinite and making the game time out. So before we go any further, you'll notice I've talked a lot about French Bread's history, but I haven't talked a lot about their, let's call it, quality. I mentioned that they started by making fan games, and fan games are typically known for their passion. They're rarely known for being tightly polished, well-balanced, and mechanically rich. Then they blew up with the Melty Blood titles, but even the most dedicated Melty Blood fans will tell you those games were busted. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that as a bad thing, not at all. Some of the best fighting games of all time were nutty and broken. But that doesn't change the fact that they were nutty and broken. You might be shocked to hear that every character in Under Night had an infinite. Well, you wouldn't be if you played Melty Blood. Yeah, you have to remember, French Bread is a small company. Very small. It was started by a group of friends and co-workers coming together, and it's kind of remained that. At the time of this recording, their team consists of only 14 people. If you just glance at the credits of Under Night, they might seem long, but when you stop and actually read them, there's a ton of names being repeated. There were many employees forced to wear a bunch of different hats in order to make these games. And that did indeed lead to problems in the actual games themselves. One of my favorite examples of this was that according to Kenichi Nohara, the lead programmer for Under Night, back when they were working on Melty Blood, they didn't have a planner. You know, the person who maps the game out. So the artist on the game would just draw whatever moves they wanted, and then they would just put the hitboxes around those animations however they thought they'd fit. The director of Under Night was Kamone Serizawa, and in a 2024 interview with Anime News Network, he was asked how he got that position. And he replied, quote, "At French Bread, there was really only one person who could act as director, which was me. So when it came time for the plan to put forward, you know, let's make Under Night, it really wasn't much of a choice. It had to be me." In fact, even Serizawa himself fully admits the team at French Bread really didn't understand how to make a balanced fighting game. Most of the employees of that company were friends and former co-workers who came together to pursue their passion. But Serizawa was hired later when French Bread realized they needed someone with more mechanical knowledge of this genre. So they scouted Serizawa, who at the time was a pro Melty Blood player and was running a website where he talked fighting game strategy. Yeah, this guy loves the whole genre. In fact, to this day, he still streams fighting games on Twitch with his pink-haired VTuber avatar. And I bring this up because Serizawa has mentioned that often the artist Yoshihara would come to him and tell him that the moves needed to be cooler, and then he would have to sit him down and explain to him that if they did that, it would kind of break the whole game. Yeah, even after all this time, French Bread was still a studio basically trying to figure things out as they went along. And that went double for Under Night. With the previous games, they had existing sources to pull from, but in this game, since everything was totally original, they were trying out a lot of new ideas, none of which really worked. For example, in an interview with the Under Night in Birth MOOC, which is what you call those really thick magazines that are the size of books. Yeah, I didn't know they had a name either. But according to the Under Night in Birth MOOC, there were several ideas that Yoshihara came up with that made it all the way to the testing phase before they realized, oh wait, that doesn't work. And yes, that's true for all fighting games. Every fighting game is going to have something in concept that doesn't pan out when you actually test it. But these weren't ideas like, oh, this move is too quick, we need to adjust that. No, these were things like originally Hyde was going to have a little girl in the story that he'd rescued, and he would have to protect her throughout the match. Yes, Hyde was going to be the first fighting game character who was also an escort mission. Or I mentioned Orie has that giant Stan Thanatos that she can summon out. Well, originally, she was also going to have a coffin that she could move around the stage. That's right, she was going to be the rare double puppet fighter. Up until they got to the testing phase and they realized, maybe there's a reason you don't often see that. So yeah, when Under Night got announced, the fighting game community perked up. They were interested to see what the Melty Blood devs had in store. And then they saw the end result and they said, oh, you know what, never mind, we're good. Actually, that's okay. You can keep this. Yeah, the initial arcade release of Under Night did not go well, but the team at French Bread didn't let that stop them. They continued to tinker with the game, patching out the various problems until September the next year when they released Under Night In Birth EXE Late, abbreviated as UNIEL, a completely updated version of the game that would eventually release on the PS3 in July 2014 in Japan and in February 2015 in the rest of the world. The name EXE Late comes from the abbreviation for extension, and the late refers to late at night. So they were basically trying to say that we were now traveling even deeper into the Hollow Night. And this is when Under Night really began. Just think of that initial arcade release as a really long beta test, because not only is this when Under Night actually became a functioning fighting game, but thanks to the home release, this is when the majority of the FGC finally got their hands on this title, and what they found was something truly unique. Time to finally talk about the gameplay of Under Night, and let me go ahead and say, there are many things that can make a great fighting game, but I feel like two important elements are a high ceiling and low floors. So many developers want to create that fighting game where any player of any skill level can pick it up and instantly find it accessible. But the more time you spend with it, the deeper it gets and the more potential you find. And so few games are really capable of pulling that off, but I will gladly count Under Night among them. Because this game is famous for how deep its mechanics get. I would be willing to argue this is one of the most complicated fighting games of this generation. If you want it to be. Because the amazing thing about Under Night is you can totally just play this game at the most basic, simple level, and you'll still have fun and find cool things that you can do. Let's start at the ground floor. There are 3 main buttons, A, B, and C, essentially light, medium, and heavy. Now, you can just mash away at A and you'll do an auto combo, but even the normal combos are incredibly easy to start with. Every single button can combo into every single other button. So you can do A, B, and C, but you can also do B, C, and A. Or you can do C-A-B, B-A-C, C-B-A, A-C-B. You can mix and match however you want, and you can easily link these standing attacks into low attacks to extend these combos even further. And this is the simplest thing in the world, and yet it still feels so good. So if you just want to hit these 3 buttons, you can do that, and you'll still have fun with this game. And of course, you can do your special moves by inputting a command and then hitting A or B, but if you hit the C button when you do that special, you'll use up half of your super meter, or as this game calls it, the Exis meter, to do a stronger EX version of that move. You can also do a unique attack that requires 100% of your Exis meter, and if you got full meter and your life total is below 30%, then you can hit all 4 buttons to do your most devastating attack, the Infinite Worth Exis. These are big flashy attacks that can help you to turn a match around or bring it to an end. And yes, I did say you could hit all 4 buttons, but we'll get to that in just a moment. For now, let's move on to the next floor of the Under Night skyscraper. Let's talk about how you can spice up these basic combos. I mentioned linking standing attacks and crouching ones, but each character has some kind of a way to pop your opponent up into the air. Typically some kind of a combination of crouching C followed by either standing or 3C. And after you pop them up, you can quickly jump after your opponent to continue your combo in the air. And many of your moves can provide you with wall bounces, ground bounces, or OTGs, so that way you can continue these combos even further. Also, many of your basic moves take on different properties if you hold the button down longer, drastically increasing your move pool. It's actually wild how much combo potential lies in just these 3 simple buttons. But now on to the next floor of the Under Night complexity creep. Let's talk about what makes each character unique. Sure, they all have different moves and reach and everything else that you would expect, but each character also has their own unique abilities. For example, Linnea, an agile character known for her speed, has a double jump. Nobody else has that, just her. Hyde is the only character whose normal attacks inflict chip damage. Cordeaux, as I pointed out earlier, can steal your opponent's meter. These little variations between characters help to make them each feel so much more unique. Like, they don't just have different moves, they're actually different characters. And beyond that, each character has a move called the Force Function, a powerful attack that often has special properties to it, performed by hitting B and C at the same time. But Force Function isn't free. It's a very powerful attack, so it does have a bill that you need to pay. However, to understand that, let's move up one more level. We have now entered the penthouse of the Under Night Mechanical Tower, or whatever the hell this metaphor was supposed to be. Time to talk about what makes Under Night, Under Night. Looking around this stage, you might have wondered, what exactly is that thing in the middle of the screen? This is the grind grid, and if you want to get good at Under Night, then this is going to be your best friend and your worst enemy. The grid fills up based upon essentially how well you play the game. If you move in on your opponent, the bar goes up. If you connect an attack, it goes up. If you get hit, it goes down. If you throw your opponent, it goes up. If you get thrown, it goes down. But if you tech a throw, then it goes way up. And most notably of all, if you successfully block an attack, then it will also go up. It's not uncommon for you to be in the lead, and then your opponent blocks a string of attacks, and now suddenly you've depleted your grid and your opponent is at max. It's a pretty interesting idea. I will say I don't agree with every way that they judge this. Like, for example, if you backdash, it causes the grid to go down, and every time that happens, I think, wait, but sometimes backdashing is the right choice. Sometimes that's a good decision. Why do you always punish for that? But for the most part, it works pretty well, and unlike a lot of other games that have a system like this, the grind grid focuses a lot on defense, and that was by design. In an interview with tournament organizer and commentator Shinobi, Under Night's director Sarazawa said that he felt in air dashers, or anime fighters, or however you want to refer to this particular genre of fighting games, players just don't block. This is a genre that is definitely defined by an unga-bunga mindset. But he thought being able to guard against a flurry of attacks was impressive, and a player should be rewarded for that. So they made guarding greatly increase your grid to place an importance on playing defensively. But there's another way to raise your grid, the D button. Yes, it's time to talk about the mythical fourth button. The fourth button that doesn't attack. You can hold down the D button and you'll start charging your grid. You can also hit the D button and tap forward to do a short hop called the Assault, And you can use your assault jump to maneuver around attacks at close range, get in on your opponent, and turn a normal attack into an overhead. Also, you can hold back with the D button to create a shield, which will prevent chip damage from special moves. But if your opponent throws you while you have your shield up, or they hit you with a low while you're shielding high, then it will cause your grid to break. And now until it heals back, you can't use your assault jump, your shield, and you can't charge your grid. And you'll notice that the grind grid is divided into, grids, and each time that you use your force function attack, it will drain your grid. And one thing that's pretty cool about this game is that if your grid is empty, you can still use your force function, but now it will give grid to your opponent. I think that's a pretty clever way to balance this all out. You want to use your force function, they don't want to keep you from using it, so if you don't have the resources, give those resources to your opponent. But that brings us to a very important question. What the hell is the grid and why does it matter who has more of it? The grind grid is essentially a tug of war because you'll notice that right there in the middle of the grid is a tiny ring that slowly fills up over time. And when enough time passes and that circle fills up, whoever has the most grids will go Vorpal. What does that mean?
No one knows what it means, but it's provocative.
No, seriously, when this game came out, nobody knew what it meant. One of the biggest critiques of the original release of Under Night is that it had so many detailed mechanics that got incredibly deep, and there was no tutorial in this game. Yeah, the folk of the French Bread were very old school. If you want to know how this game played, you had to read the booklet. What do you mean you bought this game digitally and it didn't come with a booklet? And it is not intuitive. It is not the kind of thing that you can just put your hands on and you'll figure it out after a few matches. It is incredibly detailed. In fact, you might think I've been explaining too much about this combat. I assure you, I am leaving out as much as I possibly can in order to make this video comprehensive. There are so many tiny exceptions and unique rules to everything that I'm talking about. You could write your thesis paper on the combat of Under Night. But here goes. What is Vorpal? Once that timer runs out and you go Vorpal, as signaled by this blue aura that appears around your character, you'll receive a 10% increase in your damage. You'll also gain access to a handful of new moves, such as the ability to sacrifice your Vorpal in order to knock an opponent off of you while you're blocking. But most importantly, it gives you access to Chain Shift. You can perform Chain Shift by double tapping the D button while in Vorpal, and this does two things. First, it sacrifices how many grids you've built up and it transfers them into your Exis meter. So you can use half your Exis meter on an EX move, activate Chain Shift, and then you'll get all that meter back. But if you activate Chain Shift in the middle of a combo, it will cancel that attack and freeze the screen for a moment, turning this into a Guilty Gear style Roman cancel, meaning you can start up a combo, get to the very end of it, Chain Shift, get all your meter back, and then start that combo all over again. With all the power-ups and tools that Vorpal gives you, there is a reason this is what Under Night's entire combat revolves around. The start of each match is a battle to see who can get Vorpal first, and then it becomes a fight to see who can steal it back before the timer resets. And it makes every match so incredibly tense. I would constantly be darting my eyes down to the bottom of the screen to see how many grids I had and how much time was left until Vorpal hit. Seeing both of our meters being so close to each other and knowing that every single decision would change who got this power up forces you to think fast and adjust on the fly, and you can fill your grid up or destroy your opponent's grid in a second, meaning even if you're way behind, there's always a chance to turn things around. One of the most important things in a fighting game is that back and forth, that feeling that power and advantage can change between you and your opponent at any moment. And Vorpal is a mechanic built specifically to create that feeling, and it isn't like anything else that I can think of in a fighting game. I said that French Bread ran into a lot of problems with the early builds of this game because honestly, they were just trying too many new things and they didn't work. But that crazy inventive spirit of theirs actually hit a home run on this one. This is where all that experimentation paid off big time because I cannot picture this game without the Vorpal mechanic. And what's crazy is, that's not even the only power-up this game comes with. If your Exis meter is more than halfway full, you can hit A, B, and C and you'll activate Veil Off. In this mode, your Exis slowly decreases, but until it runs out, your attack is increased by 20%, and yes, that does stack with Vorpal. So if you have Vorpal and Veil Off, you are going to be doing 30% more damage. But also while you're in this mode, you can use your EX moves and supers and they'll eat up far less of your meter. So if your Exis is full, you can go Veil Off, use an EX move, use another EX move, and then finish it off with your big super. There is so much that you can do in this game, so much creativity and experimentation. It is wild how detailed the combat in this game is. However, as I said, one of the great things about Under Night isn't that it's complex. It's that it's complex if you want it to be. That complexity has a range to it. Did your mind melt when I went into all the different uses of Vorpal? Then don't worry about it. A, B, and C. That's all you need to know to start. Congrats! You hit those 3 buttons and you just did a 3-hit combo. Oh, did you get Vorpal but you can't remember all the different things that I said it does? Then don't worry about it. It's giving you a 10% damage buff without you having to do anything else. Just keep doing those simple 3-hit combos and Vorpal's still giving you a buff. Keep it up, and when you're comfortable with it, you can try and learn something else. I outlined multiple layers of difficulty that this game comes with, but the way that Under Night is able to just ease players through each of those levels is genius. However, one of the things that makes Under Night so unique is that if you heard everything that I just said, and you look at this art style, and you think about these developers' track record, you're probably expecting this to be some big, high-flying, over-the-top slugfest. Except it really isn't. I already mentioned with the grind grid, they wanted to place an importance on defense because they felt most so-called anime fighters were too aggressive. But also, Melty Blood was known for its insane levels of aerial maneuverability. The moment you popped your opponent into the air, you were not coming down. So French Bread made a conscious decision with Under Night to make it far more grounded. They wanted it to be more of a footsie-heavy game about feeling your opponents out rather than another high-flying game where characters were just zipping all over the screen. In fact, in the EXE Late Edition, they even add more anti-air moves specifically to make sure that people sat their butts down and stayed on the ground. And because of that, it makes Under Night something really different. It's got incredible speed, running and jumping feels so quick and smooth, and yet you're not flying all over the screen. You are still largely planted on the ground the whole time, making this a game where one moment you'll be pulling off a big combo that keeps going on, and then you Roman cancel and you keep it going and you're popping each other into the air with wall bounces and OTGs and you're just doing the biggest, craziest things you can imagine. But then the next moment, you and your opponent are shimmying back and forth playing footsies, looking to get a poke in and studying up on your fundamentals. And because of that, the FGC has come to largely refer to Under Night as Anime Street Fighter. Which is weird because I thought the alpha games were Anime Street Fighter, but I get your point. And I love that the game's director, Kamone Serizawa, was told that the FGC calls it Anime Street Fighter, and he takes that as a compliment. He's proud of it. It's kind of exactly what he wanted. So the game was now on home consoles, and over the course of several patches, they had heavily retooled it to make it more balanced. Serizawa said that his biggest regret with the original release of the game was, quote, combos could be chained together more than we had anticipated. Which is maybe the nicest way I've ever heard anyone say, the infinites! We didn't plan on the infinites! But he also regretted how high the damage was, so they shortened combos, gave characters more opportunities to recover to keep them from being juggled continuously, and they severely reduced the damage. In other words, the game was finally shaping into something playable, something fun, something that could really grab players' attention. But that's not all the UNIEL version of this game added. It also came with 4 brand new characters. There's Amnesia's chief strategist, Chaos. Chaos was an intellectual obsessed with studying the night, and after gaining the power to bring books to life, he stole an ancient tome from Lich Christ known as the Chaos Code. Yes, the guy named Chaos found a book called the Chaos Code. It's almost like it was made for him. He now uses his powers and this book to summon out a giant beast called Ajidaka, which means that Chaos is our first true puppet fighter, attacking alongside Ajidaka to confuse and overwhelm the opponent. Chaos is known for his hostility and cold nature. He constantly talks crap to everybody and views everyone else as an idiot who is beneath him. Except for Gordeau! Yeah, he actually gets super buddy-buddy with his fellow Amnesia agent. His personality changes so much around Gordeau, it's kinda jarring. Next up is Nanase. She's a young girl who wandered into the night looking to get revenge against her fellow classmate, Hyde. Why does she want revenge on him? Well, because according to Nanase, Hyde is a pervert who, and I am quoting here, I cannot stress that enough, quote, defiled her body. Okay, this looks bad. But when you get to the end of her arcade lair, you find out that the reason why she thinks Hyde is a pervert is because she constantly sees him hanging out with Lene, and she assumes that he is taking advantage of this young girl. And when she says he, quote, defiled her body, what she means is she stumbled into the Hollow Knight, found Hyde in there, and was attacked by a void, turning her into an invert. Okay, A few things. One, I know it's traditional to have plots where some kind of a miscommunication leads to wacky hijinks and misunderstandings, but Nanase, there was seriously no other way that you could have phrased that. That might be the worst possible way to say, I got superpowers. And two, Nanase has the power to control the wind. I could understand being pissed if you mutate into a giant monster, but out of all the X-Men you could have turned into, Storm is not a bad option. You kinda won the lottery on that one. So yeah, in case you can't tell, I'm not the biggest fan of Nanase's character. However, mechanically speaking, she's actually a ton of fun. Very agile and quick, she can set up attacks to cover her as she goes in. She's great. I actually think she's one of the best designed characters in this installment. Our next fighter is Byakuya. His power comes in the form of spider legs that poke out of his back, and these give him some good reach and specials that combo together incredibly well, but his ultimate tool is his webbing. Byakuya tends to be pretty top tier, and it's because he can set up webbing all over the stage that he can use to quickly jump around and also trap the opponent if they happen to get too close to it. A high-level Byakuya can keep you from even being able to move. Now as for Byakuya's backstory, he's a young boy who was in love with Tsukuyomi, his sister. Oh, you mean it was like a familial kind of love, like they were just really close as a family? No, I don't mean that. I mean his entire room is covered in swimsuit photos of her. And if I can take a moment to editorialize real quick, ew! Yeah, he is obsessed with her. Every single thing that he says is about his sister. But then one day, she dies, and Byakuya is overwhelmed with despair. He starts aimlessly wandering around the town until he ends up walking into the night and being attacked by voids. Now, you might think, wait, his sister died? Then who is then his intro and outros? Did she somehow come back to life? Nope, because that isn't his sister. That's a woman named Strix, who was a member of Ogre's gang. Yeah, remember them from way back in the beginning? She was an inbirth with the power to enhance other people's powers, and because of that, she served as Ogre's right hand, up until Ogre was defeated and fell into the abyss in his fight with Amnesia. But as Strix was escaping, she was confronted by her friend and fellow gang member, Zohar. Zohar was slowly being corrupted by the abyss as well, causing her to go mad. She attacked Strix, damaging her body and weakening her powers, because as I mentioned earlier, in-birth's bodies don't work like normal human bodies, they're basically vessels that contain their powers. So if you damage them, then they can start to lose those powers, they can begin to leak out of them. It's complicated, but it does play into the plot. Well, Byakuya has been exploring the night in the hopes that his sister might be alive and somewhere inside of it. And Strix has been exploring the night in the hopes of finding her friend Zohar so that way she can fight her, damage her body, and drain her powers, thereby freeing Zohar from the corruption of the abyss. Essentially, Zohar is full of too much abyss energy and Strix wants to poke a hole in her to let the bad vibes out. Well, one night Byakuya sees Strix and notices that she looks just like his sister. The two of them begin to talk and Strix realizes she can't fight, she can just make other people stronger. So, the two of them strike a deal. Byakuya will accompany Strix to find Zohar and defeat her, and in return, Strix will dress and act like his sister. This might be the least healthy relationship I have ever covered in a game. Someone call up one of those psychologist react channels and tell them to check out the characters of Under Night. I think all these people need professional help. And then our final character is actually a guest character, Akatsuki from Akatsuki Blitzkampf. It's that game with the tank. Yeah, there you go, Akatsuki Blitzkampf, you all know it. Akatsuki Blitzkampf is a smaller game that never really left Japan, but the people who have played it swear by it. They rave about its simple and refined combat that feels like a perfect tribute to classic grounded games of the 90s. If you want to know more about it, again, Gal Win Quotes did a video on it, totally worth checking it out. Now, Akatsuki joined this game because everyone at French Bread were big fans of Akatsuki Blitzkampf. They even say that game inspired them to add a quick rematch feature to this game, which is kind of odd that you needed someone to tell you to add an instant rematch option. But the team behind Akatsuki Blitzkampf also started out in doujin circles. That's how these developers originally met, and that team even helped French Bread with the sprite work for the original Under Night release. So this partnership came pretty naturally. In fact, the Akatsuki devs even gave French Bread some of the raw sprites from their game to copy for his moveset. Also, while we're on the topic, another reason why Akatsuki was included in this game is because Narita is a huge fan of guest characters. He wanted to add even more into this game, and the number one game that he wanted a guest character from? Skullgirls. Yeah, not Street Fighter or Fatal Fury or any of those other games that he say inspired him. No, the number one game that he wanted a guest character from was another small indie game from the other side of the planet. They never got that Skullgirls guest character, but they did get some bonus art for the home release of the game from the Skullgirl devs, so that's kinda nice. Now as for who the heck Akatsuki is, he's essentially Japanese Steve Rogers. He was a soldier in World War II, signed up for an experiment to turn him into a super soldier, then he got frozen and thawed out in the modern day. Now, I'll be honest with you, I've never played Akatsuki Blitzcomp, so I can't speak to how he plays compared to his original game, but just speaking of his appearance in here, I think Akatsuki is great. He's an insanely strong Shoto with some really powerful attacks, and personality-wise, he just feels like a good dude, and I'm glad that we got that because, mechanically speaking, I think all 4 characters added to the home release were great. But personality-wise, yeah, each of them were a little problematic. But Akatsuki, hey, you don't have to worry about that with this guy. He's a good dude, he's a soldier, he fought during World War II, Wait. If he fought for Japan during World War II, then doesn't that mean that he fought on the side of... Okay, so after some real quick research, I can say that Akatsuki Blitzcomp takes place in an alternate history, so it wasn't actually World War II, even though it kind of resembles it in a lot of ways. But even if it was, he still rebelled against his own army in that game, so he's not on the side of the bad guys. Let's stop talking about this now. It's getting really uncomfortable. We will not be doing an Akatsuki Blitzcomp retrospective anytime soon. So, Under Night was on home consoles, it was available worldwide, which raises the question, how was it received? Well, I'm not going to lie, it didn't exactly catch on with casual audiences. I mean, only the most diehard fighting game players even knew this game existed. However, among that audience, yeah, it did pretty well. And I think French Bread realized that's who their target audience would be. Because I mentioned how complex the combat of this game was, and that's kind of rare for a brand new fighting game. Normally a brand new title will start off small and simple and then add more complexity as later versions of the game come out. Under Night, on the other hand, just threw 20 made-up words at your feet and said, hey, good luck with that. But Kamoni Serizawa said that the game needed that complexity. Remember, he came from the world of competitive fighters, and in that interview with Shinobi that I mentioned earlier, he said if they don't make the game complex enough, then the competitive audience will get bored with it, which, yeah, is kind of a smart strategy. I mean, most fighting games tend to aim themselves at casual audiences because those audiences are far larger. However, those audiences typically also want tons of content and cutting-edge graphics, and all of that costs money. Money that French Bread didn't have. However, the competitive audience cares far more about the actual combat of the game, and they tend to be far more dedicated, more loyal to a game. If they find a game that they like, they will stick with it for years. So Serizawa realized if they couldn't get that big casual audience, then they needed to aim for the competitive crowd. And that gamble paid off. The competitive audience for this game started off small, but it quickly began to grow. Players were loving that this game had the speed of an air dasher, but had the grounded gameplay of a more traditional fighter. It was a game of inches that played like you were moving at miles. And the Vorpal system provided players with a secondary mind game unlike anything else. It felt like a game of chess and a game of checkers at the exact same time. Don't get me wrong, it still had problems. Damage was still really high, Waldstein still had an infinite, and it was incredibly unbalanced. However, it was the originality of the game that kept bringing players in. There's a great little documentary that Hold Back to Block did on how the community for this game rose up over years called Long Live the Night, and I highly recommend checking it out. I'll be linking it in the card that's popping up right here. But essentially, this became a real grassroots push. This community grew up from one player to another, one Discord group at a time. When major tournaments refused to let UNIEL in, these players started organizing around smaller venues. The UNIEL community was basically like old-timey salesmen just loading up in their trucks and traveling across the country from town to town. And after spending years pushing this game ahead inch by inch, this community was finally about to get the big boost that it had been waiting for.
かせ深き夜のしじままでも届け鋼の翼旅立つ空に生まれた意味求め羽ばたく傷ついた体を駆り立てて縛られる魂を抱き寄せ終わりへ落ちるだけ鋼の体導きたどり歩む意味に満たしさすらうここに刻むよ生きた証鼓動を祈り希望を再び交わるとばり切り裂いて
After the last version of Under Night, the game started to grow. More eyes were being put on French bread, not just from players, but from other companies as well. Thanks to the success of their original title, they were hired by Sega to make the fighting game Dengeki Bunko Fighting Climax, a crossover that would bring together various characters from Dengeki Bunko light novels. And considering they said they wanted Under Night to be, quote, a light novel fighting game, this feels rather appropriate. Also, I'd like to remind everyone, the entire reason they started working on Under Night was because no other studio would hire them. So to now have Sega knocking on their door asking them for help shows what an impact Under Night made. And thanks to all this success, the next version of Under Night was about to see its biggest update yet. Releasing in arcades in July 2015, on consoles in Japan in July 2017, and in the rest of the world in February 2018, this was Under Night In-Birth EXE Latest, abbreviated to UNIST. And this was the big kick that Under Night was waiting for. Not only did this game serve as the perfect jumping on point for any player who had spent the last 2 years hearing people talk about this style, but also mechanically, this game refined itself so much. It plays immensely better than the previous version. In fact, this was the version of the game that I started with, and going back to UNIEL, felt like I was playing in mud. Don't get me wrong, UNIEL is still a good game, but UNIST just does everything better. First up, the damage is reduced, addressing one of the biggest complaints that players had, while making the combat more aggressive. Yes, I know that French Bread wanted this to be a game that focused more on defense, but maybe they leaned into that a bit much. The balance between offense and defense in this game feels much better. Plus, there were multiple characters in the previous version who felt broken. They were just way too strong. So making each character more aggressive made it easier to get in on those fighters and turn the table on them. There were also a handful of new mechanics introduced, and each of them were huge improvements for the game. You still had your normal veil off, but now when you were doing a combo, you could hit all 3 of your attack buttons at once to do cross-cast veil off. Cross-cast, just like chain shift, will reset your combo, but you can then immediately hit all 3 buttons again to activate your big super. And it feels amazing ending a combo like this. I found myself constantly breaking this move out even when I didn't need to, just because it was so cool. But if you ask me, the most important update that this version of the game made is that now when you go into Vorpal, every single character gets some kind of a buff that's unique just to them. I've heard some people say that there were always character-specific buffs to Vorpal, but not like this there weren't. Now when you go into Vorpal, every single character will either get a brand new move, or their pre-existing moves will have different properties to them that have tons of new potential behind them, and these moves feel perfect. Not only are they powerful, but they're also distinct enough that even if you're unaware that this is a thing, you'll be able to instantly tell, oh, this is different now. The moment I go into Vorpal, suddenly I can do things I could not do before. For example, Aurier's force function is a flip that helps her to get over your opponent. But when you're in Vorpal, you can now do 2 of those flips at once. Gordeau's force function is a claw slash that can crumple your opponent. But when you're in Vorpal, the startup time is faster and the range is longer. Merkaba has a move where he plants a little tiny mini monster on the ground that starts jumping around to attack you. But if he gets hit, it'll disappear. But now in this installment, if he's in Vorpal, then he can get hit while blocking, and it won't affect his little monster sidekick. You can now plant one of these down, start blocking, and while your opponent is trying to get through your defenses, your little monster buddy there will do all the attacking for you. Waldstein's force function lets him pull a chunk of the ground up and throw it at the opponent. A helpful tool for a big bulky character like him. You know what's even more helpful? When you go into Vorpal, and now that projectile causes a wall bounce that can easily be comboed into further attacks. These are wonderful additions. Vorpal was already a good buff in the previous games, but now when you enter it, it feels like you've got a brand new character. And hey, best of all, this installment actually fixed one of the biggest problems with all the mechanics in the game. They finally explained all the mechanics in the game. Yes, this version added a tutorial, and normally I wouldn't stop to point out a tutorial, but Under Night's tutorial is legendary. It's one of the biggest, longest, most in-depth tutorials in any fighting game ever. How big is it? Pretty damn big. And it goes into even the tiniest details. I've been playing this game for about 6 years now, and I still learned stuff from going through this tutorial I had never even heard anyone mention. What do you mean I can cancel my opponent's Vorpal with a veil off? Since when was that a thing? These tutorials make you realize there is a depth to this combat that you're not going to appreciate from just picking it up and pressing buttons. But that wasn't the biggest addition to this version. No, after throwing a mountain of lore at players with no explanation, they finally included a story mode. Kind of. It's called Chronicles mode, and this is essentially the novelization of Under Night. There's no combat, you're just reading the backstory of each character, and it is helpful to learning more about them and this world. But holy crap, this thing drags. Listen, I know a lot of light novel and visual novels love to embellish and monologue, but even by those standards, this one just keeps going and going and going. Each character's prequel is about an hour long, and they could easily be half that. We did a retrospective on BlazBlue, and I went through every single inch of those games. So I'm used to these big, over-the-top, massive story modes, but typically in these stories, the plot actually, moves ahead, things are happening. A huge chunk of these chronicles are just characters thinking to themselves, contemplating what just happened or what's about to happen. And I understand that can be a good way to reveal insight into a character's personality, but they go way too far with it. The plot does not move enough to warrant this length. And I feel so bad for the translators on this game because you can tell that having to do this massive story mode was definitely pushing them to their limits because there are spelling errors all over the place in this thing. And normally I wouldn't stop to point something like that out, but every single time that I ran into a new one, all I could do was think, man, these poor translators did not sign up for this. When they heard they were working on a fighting game, they did not think they were going to have to translate a novel. Listen, if I'm saying something is long-winded, you know it's a problem. However, I do have to give it credit for a few things. For starters, this game wanted to give you an understanding of these characters, and yeah, it does that alright. You will now understand these fighters inside and out, as well as future fighters. It's actually pretty impressive how much this team thought out this cast, because there are so many times that brand new characters pop up in this story, and I thought, wait, I know them. They got added to this game like 3 years down the road. In fact, that's been true since the start. In the very opening to the arcade release of the very first game, there are silhouettes of characters who wouldn't be added until 8 years later. I think that's pretty cool that this team was thinking that far into the future about a game they weren't even sure would sell. But speaking of those new characters, there were 4 added to this version of the game. First up is Enkidu. He's another member of Amnesia, although he isn't there because he's friends with the rest of them or because he cares about their big power grab. No, he's just there because he wants to fight strong opponents, and Amnesia told him they could make that happen. In fact, while Enkidu is an in-birth, his actual powers are pretty small. This dude fights mostly just with his actual raw physical power, and if you're just getting into the game, he is incredibly new player friendly. Not only does he hit like a truck, but his basic combos are some of the easiest in the game to learn. He can link his B attacks into other B attacks and his C attacks into other C attacks. So you can do a big combo by hitting A, B, 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 C, C, C. You want a character that makes you feel really strong but is not that hard to figure out? You pick Enkidu. Next, after all this time, we finally got some new members of Lich Christ. First is Mika. She's an upbeat, hyperactive girl who is friends with Aurier, but her impulsive attitude often gets her into trouble. She's got super strength and a pair of giant gauntlets that let her fly across the stage, smashing into the opponent or leaping in close to grab them. At release, Mika was very strong. At least that's what the developers thought, because remember how I said each character got brand new abilities when they go Vorpal? Well, that wasn't true for Mika, because they thought that she was already so strong she shouldn't get an additional bonus. I mean, she can still use Chain Shift and she still gets the 10% damage boost, but that's it, nothing else. I've seen a lot of devs over the years struggle to try and balance their characters, but it's rare that you see them throw their hands up in the air and say, dude, I don't know, just don't give her that thing and hope it all works out. French bread, they're trying their best. Then there's Wagner. She's one of the top soldiers for Lich Christ with unparalleled power, and she knows it. Yeah, Wagner comes from a long line of high-ranking Lich Christ members, and she's got all the ego that a lineage like that could bring. At least on the surface. Underneath it all, she's a bit more reserved. As for how she fights, Wagner uses flame-based attacks that often link together to help her move across the stage very quickly. When you watch a really good player on Wagner, you'll see them going corner to corner like they're taking a Sunday stroll, because Wagner just has so many ways to keep linking her moves together. Then the last brand new character is also our first exposure to a totally new team in the Undernight world. Phonon is a cold, serious woman with a long, snake-like whip that she uses to lash out punishment as she laughs wickedly at her opponents, reveling in how strong she is. Or at least that's what she wants you to think. Yeah, Phonon talks a good game when she's up against her opponent. She's laughing and saying how she'll destroy them with her whip. But on the inside, she's a sweating, anxious mess. Something is up with this character. But when she gets to the end of her arcade ladder, she runs into her classmate Nanase, who just says, "Oh hey Yoshiko." "What? Yoshiko? That's not my name. I'm Phonon." "Phonon? Wait. You mean like that character in that anime?" "Oh yeah, I watched that when I was a kid. It was okay." And that's when I realized, wait, Phonon is just a big nerd pretending to be cool? And yeah, after that, I kind of love this character. Listen, I got a soft spot for dorks trying to act like they know what they're doing. I built my entire channel around it. So, who is Phonon actually? She was an aspiring writer who loved the supernatural, so she began investigating this mysterious knight that she had been hearing about, only to get attacked by a void. She survived and was taken in by a group called the EFG, the Existence Force Guardians. They're a group of students who all awaken their in-birth powers and are taking it upon themselves to protect everyone from the night. They gave Phonon some combat training and taught her how to use her new sound-based powers, so that way she could become another heroic member of the EFG. But Phonon didn't really care about any of that. Instead, she just said, wait, I got superpowers? And once a month, a bunch of in-births get together and fight each other in the night? Oh, hell yeah! See ya, losers! Thanks for all the training, now lose my number, don't ever call me again, bye! You remember how I said they want to give this game a Chunibyo style? Phonon is all about that. She's a teen who got superpowers and decided to live out her power fantasies. As for how she fights, well, she's got a whip and sound-based projectiles, so you're probably assuming that she's a zoner, and yeah, there's definitely some of that in there. But Undernight is a game that loves to keep popping your opponents back up into the air, and with Phonon's reach, she is all about that. She might as well join the circus because she is a juggler. And in case you're wondering why her whip is alive, that's because when the EFG found her, they gave her a void fragment. Which is exactly what it sounds like, it's just a chunk of a void. And when an in-birth touches a void fragment, they can turn it into a weapon. And for Phonon, this girl who wants to be a tough badass, her fragment turned into an adorable snake named UNIEL that likes to say its own name like a Pokemon. Now, one more thing that I should bring up, Phonon was in the original pitch for this game, and boy, if you think Lene and Hyde changed a lot from their initial pitch, get a load of this. Originally, Phonon was going to be a character named Chimidi. She would be sadistic and fight with a whip, but she would also be kind of blind. She would have really poor eyesight, but she would have great hearing, so she would use that to fight. But the biggest change of all is that originally, she was going to be Gordeau's sister. But Gordeau also originally fought with a whip, and then they decided to give him a scythe, so then they decided that didn't really make sense for the two of them to be siblings, because I guess in this world, siblings all use the same weapons. So yeah, long story short, that idea got thrown out. But to this day, whenever the French bread developers take questions on Undernight, they still get asked questions about whether or not Chimidi could get turned into an original character and brought back. So as I said, between the changes to the combat, the new characters, the new modes, this was the biggest update that Undernight had gotten so far. And it paid off. Not only did this game reach a much larger audience, but as I mentioned, the combat was just so much better. Before this, even the people who were enjoying Under Night would gladly admit it had some problems. But now this was a game that felt like it could stand side by side with its top competitors. And when you looked at the tournament scenes, you could see its reach growing. In 2018, a brand new tournament started up in Atlanta, Georgia that would specifically focus on French-bred fighters like Melty Blood, Dengeki Bunko, and of course, Under Night. This was Climax of Night, and over 7 years, this served as the biggest celebration of all things French-bred, and eventually grew to include multiple smaller fan-favorite fighters like Akatsuki Blitzkampf, Skullgirls, Darkstalkers, and of course, Sailor Moon S. The real ones understand. This became a major tournament across America, and it all started because these French-bred games were speaking to an audience. Unfortunately, 2025 was its last year, but not because of a lack of attendance. No, instead, it was because of very understandable issues with money and time. Two things that running a tournament require massive amounts of. According to tournament organizer Shinobi, quote, "It was a mixture of things, but the most prominent ones were money and fulfillment. Even if I had unlimited money, CON wouldn't have been around much longer. I'm extremely proud of that body of work and all the friends that helped me along the way. The French-bred community is now stronger than ever." And he's right. Doing this retrospective and going through Under Night's history, it is incredible watching how this entire company and their player base have exploded and continue to grow with every single year. I mean, speaking of Climax of Night, this was it in its first year. This was it in its last. And I honestly can't think of a better visual indicator of how this player base has grown. And speaking of growing, in 2019, after years of pushing for it, Under Night was added to the biggest stage in the world and became a featured game at EVO, giving it the most attention this game has ever gotten. And with this rush of new players joining the night, what did French-bred do? They released another update for the game. It really shouldn't surprise you at this point. It's kind of what French-bred does. This was Under Night In-Birth EXE Late CLR, abbreviated as UNICLR, Unicorn. It's Under Night Unicorn now. I give up. And for the first time, this update would release worldwide at the exact same time in February of 2020, which was just the best possible time to release a new version of your fighting game that didn't have great online. This was probably the smallest update to the game yet. There was of course a balance update, several characters now got brand new moves, but after that there was one brand new character add and that was about it. This fighter was Lodrekia Light. He's a high-ranking member of the organization Ritter Shield. What is Ritter Shield? Well, remember how I said after Wallenstein left Lich Kreis hundreds of years ago, their leader Adelheid became so angry that she banned men from serving in her army? Well, she had to put all those male soldiers somewhere, so she created Ritter Shield and declared that Ritter Shield would be underlings to Lich Kreis. But Lodrekia wants Adelheid to recognize Ritter Shield as equal, so he trained his whole life to take down the Lich Kreis star pupil. That's right, he is Wagner's rival, and since Wagner uses fire, then by the intrinsic laws of Mortal Kombat, that means that Lodrekia must use ice. He can freeze you, place traps on the stage, he zooms around the stage like he's a figure skater. He's a very strong character, but he's also kind of a big brain character. You can't just throw out his ice moves and hope that freezes the opponent. No, you need to be at the exact right distance from your opponent to make that happen, so you gotta think everything through. But that was it for this version of the game. As I said, this was definitely the smallest update that Under Night had gotten so far. So you know what? Since we got some time, let's talk about something that I have been pointing off this entire episode and is one of the biggest selling points of this game. The presentation. In the vast sea of fighting games, you need your tile to have its own look, its own style. You need something that makes it stand out, and there is nothing else out there like Under Night. After deciding that this tile would have more of a light novel feel, the characters were designed to be more fashionable, and I think they nailed it. Each of these fighters look like they're ready to pose on an album cover. A very moody album cover. And Yoshihara mentioned that he was a fan of Darkstalkers, and I'm not just mentioning that because I have a problem and I will always shove Darkstalkers into any conversation. No, I'm bringing that up because he says that made him want to give this game a dark and spooky tone. However, it's not your typical gothic horror. No, this feels far more modern. This game's story revolves heavily around online rumors. The Voids resemble the type of shadow people that you would find in creepypastas. The setting is a major metropolis that feels incredibly real, but everything is empty, giving it this disturbing, uncanny feeling. The kind of horror that Under Night goes for is the online urban legend brand of horror, and I can't think of another fine game out there that goes for that aesthetic. And of course, when talking about the visuals of Under Night, we have to bring up its most striking feature. Whatever the hell all this text is, every inch of the screen before and after the fight is loaded with paragraphs of text that slide on and off the screen so fast you will never read it. On the character select screen, on the versus screen, on the round start, there is a novella in every frame of this game. And then of course there's the actual terminology. If you want your fighting game to stand out from others, then you can't just say round 1 fight. Nah. You have to give it some flavor, and you have to give it your own spin. And when you start up a round of Under Night, you get treated to immortalize, recurring void effect, first clause, divide. And hey, what was that underneath the divide there? I think I saw something else. Oh right, kill each other, but it's good inverse. Oh right, of course, you can't start a friendly match without kill each other, but it's good inverse. This crazy terminology and walls of text have become some of the biggest jokes about Under Night, but I say jokes as a positive. Nobody is laughing at Under Night for this, we're laughing with it. The FGC loves this about this game. Under Night would not be what it is without all of this. If you put out a brand new Under Night and it just said round 1 fight, I would tell you to put that back in the oven because it is not done yet. However, as good as all of the visuals in this game are, they are dwarfed by the music. I will say this with zero hint of exaggeration. I think Under Night In-Birth has the most underrated soundtrack of any fighting game. Because sure, I will admit, I think there's a few fighting games out there that have better songs than this, but everyone acknowledges those games. Under Night is fairly unknown by the larger audiences, but I guarantee I could put on this album and you'd all start rocking out to it. Hell, you probably already have. I can't tell you how many times I've been watching a random YouTube video and suddenly I hear Under Night music in the background. There's like a secret club of YouTube editors out there who just trade Under Night tracks back and forth with each other. Each song has so much speed and impact to it. It is pure adrenaline, and they fit the characters so well. Byakuya's theme has this incredibly quick tempo and playfulness to it that almost sounds like it was designed to go hand in hand with his maniacal laughter. Gordeau's track, just like the man himself, hits hard, feels threatening, but is undeniably cool. And Hype's theme has this great build-up until it just erupts. Perfect for giving each match this rising intensity. And dear God, the guitar and keyboard riffs in these tracks are some of the best in any game. I can feel the musicians' fingers catching on fire as they play. But now that we got that out of the way, let's return to the present. Under Night had seen its biggest success yet with UNIST. They were a main game on the biggest fighting game stage of the world. They had the wind at their back and the future was looking bright. So it was time to continue the story of the Hollow Knight with their next update, which this time would actually finally continue the story of the Hollow Knight.
切り裂く光赤く螺旋を抱いて待ち焦がれた無限飲み込まれて契約の地懐かしい闇よ崩れ触ってそして人となりで約束した戦いのその先は巡る因果に消えな
Under Night In-Birth 2 would release worldwide on January 25th, 2024, and no, your eyes are not playing tricks on you. There is an actual number in that tile now. That's right, we're in Sequel Town, baby! After over 10 years, the plot finally advanced, and so the gameplay. In fact, I'd be willing to say that out of all the previous updates, this one feels the most significant. Don't get me wrong, it still resembles the previous games, combos work the same way, all the moves and mechanics are still here, but there's just enough changes made that it does actually feel like a brand new game. It earns that 2 in the title. For starters, your meter builds faster. In an interview with Anime News Network, Kamoni Serizawa said, quote, "We felt that sometimes the fights were just a little dull, and we thought about how to make them a bit more exciting. And we wanted the game to look a lot more flashy. A very easy way to do that was to give them more gauge to play with. So that was one thing that we did. We adjusted the growth of the gauge so that way people could get access to more of their special moves and make the game a little more flashy to watch. And yeah, mission accomplished. I definitely know supers being thrown out way more often in Under Night 2. You can now spin that Excess meter like never before. Although in most games when I say that, I'm saying it as a compliment. You've all heard me talk before about the importance of your cool moves budget. How many resources you need for your moves and how much work it takes to get those resources compared to how good your moves are. Does it feel like the work you put into it is worth the move you get? And in here, your cool moves budget is low. You can get so much meter. But honestly, as weird as it's going to be for me to say this, I think it might be a little bit too low. I think that cool moves budget should maybe be a little bit more expensive. Yeah, this game feels like it leans more into aggression than the previous Under Nights, and hey, I do enjoy aggressive gameplay. But as I pointed out, one of the things that made Under Night unique was it balanced itself between offense and defense. It was a game that was more about blocking and spacing and gaining a good poke rather than just going in and relentlessly attacking. And there was an appeal to that. But now it feels a bit more like the anime fighters that people kept comparing it to, and that does take away a bit of its identity. And this isn't just me saying this, no, players were critical at launch of how offense heavy it was. Don't get me wrong, Under Night 2 is still a good game. Players still liked it. I don't want to make it sound like this game came out and people started chucking their copies in a bonfire. No, people liked this game. People were happy with it. Just some people liked the last version more, and that hadn't really happened with Under Night. And speaking personally, I'll admit, when the game first came out, I did like the previous versions of Under Night more. This one just felt a little bit off. It felt like there was just too much stuff going on. However, after spending a couple months with it and getting used to the game, I've completely come around on it. Now this is my new favorite version of Under Night. Once I got used to it, I came to love all the balance adjustments and all the brand new additions they made to the gameplay. Speaking of those additions, Under Night 2 includes 3 totally new mechanics. First up, there is a brand new type of Vorpal called Celestial Vorpal. Now if you charge your grid up so much that when the Vorpal timer runs out, you have more than 50% of the overall grid, then it just gives you all the remaining slots. Yes, they implemented a feature that says that if you're doing so well, you get even a toe into your opponent's side of the grid, you get all of your opponent's grid. I'll admit, at first I didn't really see much of a point to this because it felt like a real the rich get richer style mechanic. It felt like it was saying, hey, you're already in the lead, let's put you even more in the lead. But that's because I play at more of a casual level, and by that I mean I'm not very good. And if you're playing at my level, odds are you're never going to see this hit. You have to actually work to make Celestial Vorpal happen at that level of gameplay. But then I started watching high-level footage of the game and I realized, oh, this isn't here for the guy who lands 30 hits in a row. This is here for the guy who blocks 30 hits in a row. Yeah, grid still rises fast while you're blocking in this game, and if you spend 10 seconds straight successfully blocking everything that your opponent throws at you, then you're going to go Celestial Vorpal, stare your opponent in the face and say, my turn. So yeah, when I look at this as more of a comeback mechanic, it's kind of awesome. Then there's a brand new attack called the Steer Ender. This is a move that can only be done while in a combo by hitting A and B, and as the name implies, it's an ender. When you realize that you're getting close to the end of your combo, hit these 2 buttons and it'll finish things off with a big attack. However, if you use it right after you start a combo, it'll give you a big boost to your grid. So if you land a hit on your opponent, you may be tempted to keep the combo going, but if you notice that the Vorpal timer is about to run out and you really want that buff, you can choose to hit Steer Ender after only 1 hit, get a boost to your grid, and now you've turned the tides on your opponent and you're the one with Vorpal. Although on the other side of that coin, if you save your steer ender after a big long combo, then it will actually use some of your grid. I'm assuming the idea here was that if you choose to sacrifice a big combo by ending it early with a steer ender, then you'll get a bonus to your grid. But if you do the big long combo and then you decide to get greedy and go in for one more hit, then it's going to cost you. And lastly, there's a brand new move called Creeping Edge. You perform this by pressing 3D, in other words diagonally down, forward, and D. When you do this, you'll do a quick dodge forward that gets past moves and escapes an opponent who's constantly pressuring you. And while this does seem strong, you can be thrown out of it, which leads into a grid break. I like the Creeping Edge. I think out of all the additions made to this version of the game, this is probably the strongest. It's fun, it's useful, it definitely has a purpose, but it's not broken. There is a downside to it, there's a risk to using it. It's actually a pretty decent mechanic. So combat-wise, still good, still felt like Under Night, even if some players thought it was a little too aggressive now. But even those players were taking this game online so much more now. Because now you could actually take this game online. Sure, the previous versions had online, and online that shook and sputtered so much you'd think it ran on coal. Yes, Kamone Serizawa, who I remind you was a pro fighting game player, argued with his team for years that they needed rollback netcode, long before that became the standard in the industry. Problem is, French Bread had no idea how to implement a netcode. So when they moved to home consoles, they paired up with Arc System Works to provide the online. But if you know anything about Arc System Works, their games had some of the worst online in the industry. That is until Guilty Gear Strive released in 2021 with one of the best rollback netcodes on the market. Connections in that game were shockingly good and a big eye-opening moment for the entire industry for the importance of rollback. So now with Under Night 2, Arc System Works finally had the know-how to give this game the netcode it needed. And for the first time ever, it actually feels good to take Under Night online. But as I said, this game was an actual sequel, so beyond just a few new mechanics, the game also saw an update graphically. Don't get me wrong, all the old sprites from the last game are still here. French Bread doesn't throw anything out if it still works. But there were a ton of brand new stages, the UI elements all got an update, and we saw characters gain brand new moves, brand new victory animations, and brand new unique pre-round interactions. And these were all great. They give each of these characters way more, well, character. In fact, speaking of that, this is totally subjective, so maybe it's just me, but the writing feels way better too. Not that it was bad in the previous installments. Well, okay, the spelling errors and how much the story stretched out was bad, but when it came to the dialogue, it was fine. It definitely felt like it was being made by people brand new to writing their own stories. But now characters sound way more distinct. They definitely feel more realized with personalities that are uniquely theirs. And there are some characters that go through some really emotional moments in this story, and there are some other ones who have some really humorous moments that actually got some good chuckles out of me. I like the characters in the original game, they were alright, but now, I'd count some of them among my all-time favorites. This is a great cast of characters. But speaking of this game being an actual sequel, that extends to the story as well, because for the first time, we finally got a continuation of the plot. Granted, there was once again no story mode, no, we were back to just meat and potatoes arcade ladders, just like the fighting game forefathers intended. And just like in the first game, the story begins in the middle of the action, so there's no real explanation about how we got to this point. There is a little info on the character select screen telling you what every character has been up to since the last game, so you do get some kind of an intro, but I'm mostly bringing this up because I find it hilarious that most fighting games will pick one ending from the previous game to be the canonical one. Not here. Each character's bio says they confronted and defeated Hilda in the last game, which means that either they didn't want to sell on one ending so they left it up to you, or it means that on the last Hollow Knight, as Hilda was about to become a god, a line of people just formed outside the building patiently waiting their turn to kick her ass. Hilda wanted to become a god and she ended up going 0-20 that night. But after this battle, Linnea's brother Kuon reappeared. You remember him? He's got the other half of the seal with the secret to Exus inside of him, which also made him immortal. But Kuon didn't react as well to this as Linne did. Apparently being alive for 500 years filled with curse energy left Kuon with a real bad case of the murders. Kuon now wants to take Hyde's insulator and the other half of the seal from Linne and take them to the abyss at the center of the Hollow Knight, and then use them to open the doorway to the other world where all the voids come from, so that way he can face his true rival, Higgins.
Who?
Yeah, you know, Higgins. Kuon's old rival. Exists in the Void World? Yeah, come on, you know him. Okay, so, hey, about that, nobody knows who the hell Higgins is. And I don't mean in the game, I mean literally nobody knows him. There is zero information in this game, in interviews, or anywhere else online about who Higgins is. The only mention of him in this entire game is when you beat the arcade layer with Kuon. He then jumps into the Void World and says he's going to fight Higgins, and I swear to you, that is it. Well, you know what? If French Bread isn't going to tell us anything, then screw it. I'm just going to make it up myself. Remember how Kuon's whole village learned about Exodus from that one stranger who came to the town and they called him the Hollow God? Yeah, screw it. That's Higgins. Prove me wrong, French Bread. The point is, Kuon is trying to open the doorway to the Abyss and it will engulf the world in void, so now everyone is heading towards the center of the Hollow Knight to stop him. Except for Waldstein. I mentioned he spent the last 500 years watching over Linné because he owed Kuon his life and he was trying to fulfill a request from him. Well, in the biggest twist of this game, the moment that Kuon appears and says, hey, I'm going to try and end the world, Waldstein walks out with the NWO theme playing. Yeah, he owed Kuon a debt and he is still trying to repay it, and this isn't one of those situations where he's like, oh, but I owe him this debt, but I love this world, and I have so many fond memories of Linné and Hyde, and I want to work alongside them, but no, I must betray them. Oh, I don't know what to do. No, there's no doubts in Waldstein's mind. Kuon says he's going to try and end the world, and to do that, he's going to need Waldstein's help, and Waldstein will have to fight a lot of strong opponents, and Waldstein went, oh, dude, you have no idea how long I've been waiting to hear that. Repay my debt to my longtime friend and fight a lot of strong opponents? Those are my two favorite things! There are a couple of other character developments that are important, such as Hyde now has to learn how to fight without the help of Linné. Bordeaux, a man who had always been defined by greed, now realizes he wants to fight on the behalf of other people. Carmine is just flat out dying, which... yeah, man, you rip your own body apart in order to use your powers. I'm honestly surprised you made it this long. The human body does not have that much blood inside of it. But Waldstein is definitely the biggest surprise. Now, there are 3 new characters in the starting roster and 3 more added as DLC. First up from Lich Trice is Kaguya, who actually made her first appearance all the way back in Aurier's arcade ending in the very first game. Kaguya is very upstanding and well-mannered. She even comes off a little bit aloof and flighty at times. But she wasn't always like this. She used to be crude and foul-mouthed. She grew up in a horribly abusive home and even had to shoot her own father. Then Lich Trice took her in and completely turned her life around. She uses guns, so obviously she's got some zoning, but she's kind of a wild card. Her shots ricochet across the screen, and she can even stun the opponent with them. So if you're the type of player who can think about 8 steps ahead at all times, you can set up attacks to juggle your opponents into massive combos. Now remember I mentioned Phonom was rescued by a group of students who fight to protect people from voids called the EFG? Well, our next character is Tsurugi, the second in command of the EFG. Tsurugi is the nicest guy you'll ever meet. Too nice even. He's overly friendly and constantly talking. He's the kind of guy who sees Hyde and he thinks that they're friends and rivals, and Hyde just goes, dude, I barely know you, leave me alone. But Tsurugi just thinks he's joking. He's also got a big hero mentality about himself, and to match that, his weapon is a giant shield. In combat, you're gonna want to use that shield to, well, block, but after that you can use it to slide into the opponent, drop down on top of them, or unleash a string of Rekka attacks that have some pretty good speed and range to them. As I said, Tsurugi's a pretty straightforward guy, so in combat, you basically want to use that shield to get in close and then start swinging away. Then finally, we got our boss of the game, Kuon. And boy, he sure is a boss character, alright. He's fast, swings around a ton of swords, and just has so many tools at his disposal. Listen, you fought boss characters before, you know what they can do. But then we get into the DLC, and we start with the total wild card, Uzuki. She's another high-ranking member of Amnesia, and even appeared in Hilda's ending in the first game, but only if you got a high enough score to get the secret ending. Well, despite basically being an Easter egg in that game, she still left an impact on audiences, because French Bread held a popularity poll asking what character should be added as DLC, and she was easily the winner. In the lore, she is incredibly powerful, but also kind of an X-Factor. Even the other members of Amnesia don't know what to make of her. She's got a morbid sense of humor, she summons out skeletons, ghosts, demons, and she hangs out with a guy who dresses like a vampire and a robot. She's so strange and her powers are so sinister, people actually wonder if she's really an in-birth or a void that grew so strong, she fully took on a human form. As for her playstyle, there's no other way of putting it. Uzuki is nutty. She turns the entire stage into a spirit Halloween store. She summons skeletons out of the ground, she can use a coffin to juggle you into the air in a variety of ways, which actually makes me think that some of her moveset might have come from the original plans that they had for Aurier all the way back when this game started. But speaking of somebody who loves everything creepy and spooky and Halloween related, I love this character aesthetically, but man, I do not have the brain to play her. You need to have a plan when you start playing this character, and you need to map everything out. Then there was Ogre. You've been hearing me talk about Ogre this entire video. He was the leader of Amnesia's rival gang, Bankikai, and he died jumping into the abyss to seal it back up in the events leading up to the very first game. Ogre is actually a very chill guy. He's upbeat, he's charming, he is also very obsessed with women. In his arcade mode ending, he says, "Hey, at least I saved all the women of the world," only to then get mad when he realizes he also saved all the men of the world. He's like if Sanji got mixed up with the mob. But you're probably wondering, wait, if Ogre jumped into the abyss, then how is he back? Yeah, he's kind of wondering that too. He has no memories of how he returned. He doesn't even know if he's actually real or if he's a void that just absorbed all the memories of Ogre. And considering this is his big Infinite Worth Exis attack, yeah, he might be onto something. Now, I said that Izuki was one of the more complex characters in this game, so to balance that out, Ogre is incredibly straightforward, and his plan for battle is keep punching things until they don't get back up. He is a brawler who just goes in and applies tons of punishing pressure. I would say out of all these DLC characters, he's definitely the easiest one to start with. And the final new character is Izumi. So I said that Kuon is trying to open the door to the abyss so that way he can enter the world of the voids. And to do that, he needs the other half of the seal from Lene and hide Sword the Insulator. But there's one more element that he needs that has never been mentioned before. I still think Mori P was helping them to craft this story at this point. What they needed was the key to the door, the Initiator. And the Initiator is not Izumi. No, Izumi is a sweet, kind girl who doesn't like fighting and honestly doesn't even fully understand what the knight is. Don't worry, Izumi, you're not alone in that. However, Izumi is paired up with a mystical fish. And this fish is the Initiator. And whenever there's trouble in the night, this fish tells this poor confused girl that she needs to go into the night so that way they can protect the world. Izumi is a great character. Her personality is really fun to mix with the rest of this cast. In fact, I'll go ahead and say it. The three new DLC characters, Izumi, Ogre, and Uzuki, are all home runs. Each of them are some of my favorites in this entire series. As for her gameplay, Izumi fights with water, and yeah, that really kind of describes her combat. It's all about flowing from one move into another. Yes, I know I just described what a combo is, but when you pick her up, you'll see what I mean. Her attacks have a lot of Rekka elements to them. You can keep hitting buttons to keep adding on to her combos, making her gameplay feel very fluid. As I pointed out long ago, every single character in this game has the ability to pop opponents into the air and then knock them back down to the ground, but with Izumi it all feels so smooth, just going from one attack into the next. And you can use her force function to call out her fish partner Effie, which will add even more options onto her combos. Izumi is one of those characters who I would recommend to brand new players as well as experienced pros. It really does feel like there's something in this character for all skill levels. Also, her animations are amazing. The fish and her scarf are some of the best looking sprites in this game. But that brings us to the end of the game. So let's see exactly how the story of the Hollow Knight ends. And I do mean ends, they actually wrapped up the story in this game. Now again, there's no ending that's marked as the canonical one. It's an old school arcade ladder where everyone gets to have the big showdown with Kuon. And in Kuon and Hilda's endings, as you might imagine, they plunge the world into darkness. But in Waldstein's ending, he absorbs the seals from both Lene and Kuon into his body, thereby sacrificing himself, but in the process, freeing Lene and Kuon from their immortality curses. It's actually kind of touching. In fact, he's the only character in this arcade mode who ends up dying. So yeah, that Waldstein, pretty alright guy. He did betray Lene so that way he could go and work for his old friend, but in the end, he really just wanted to help out everybody. And fight. He mostly just wanted to fight. That was the main thing that he was all about. But outside of those and a few others, most of the endings are essentially the same. Kuon is defeated, the door to the abyss is destroyed, thereby forever ending the Hollow Knight. This results in Lene finally becoming mortal again, and she can once again live her life without the curse of resurrection. All the Inbirths start to lose their powers, and more shockingly of all, the humans who had turned into voids all return to normal. We see Ogre and Gordo's friend Roger returning to life, and even Merkava discovers that he had been human all along as he regains his original body. I'm torn on whether or not to use the SpongeBob "good grief he's naked" or "oh no he's hot" joke. And so, that was it. The story of the Hollow Knight had come to an end. Although I will stress, just the story of the Hollow Knight. The developers have said that they would be willing to do more games in the Under Night series in the future, but they wanted this game to end the story they started over 10 years ago. And I have to say, I'm pretty impressed that they were willing to give this game an ending. So many fighting game franchises are afraid to move past their beginning. Street Fighter is going to bring back Bison forever and ever. Mortal Kombat will keep rebooting their timeline. Heihachi Mishima will not die. But this game actually said, hey, you know the entire premise of our games? Yeah, it's done. Honestly, I have to respect that. But with Under Night 2 finally out, how did it do? I've talked about how this franchise slowly built up a dedicated competitive player base, but it still never reached that larger casual audience. But now, after years of game momentum, this felt like the perfect time to finally make that happen. To finally make its name known. That, unfortunately, did not happen. In fact, Under Night 2's release kind of went under the radar for many people. But why is that? Is it because this combat was so complex? Is it because this still felt like an older arcade-era game? Did casual audiences not want a game with sprites? Was it too outdated? I don't know. It's really hard to say, and I don't think there's any one specific reason. Although if I had to say there was one specific reason, it might have had something to do with the fact that this game released on January 25th, 2024. And you know what else released on literally the exact same day? The biggest fighting game release of the year. Yes, Tekken 8 released on, and again, I cannot stress this enough, literally the exact same day. Why? Oh, why would you release your fighting game? A game in a genre that is known for being niche and having audiences that need to focus all their time on one specific game on the exact same day as your biggest competition that year. I've looked for answers from the studio, but I've never even seen them acknowledge this outside of a very brief mention of, oh yeah, you know, some other games released around that time, we don't need to say which ones. It honestly boggles my mind. It's not like they needed the sales right then. Most games need to come up with money before the end of the fiscal year. The fiscal year ends in March. You could have pushed this back 2 months and been fine. This decision is just baffling to me, and I've heard people argue, no, it's fine. Tekken and Under Night are very different types of fighting games. They appeal to different audiences. Listen, I won't deny that Tekken and Under Night are very different games. But you're assuming that there is no overlap in that Venn diagram. You're assuming nobody who plays Under Night also plays Tekken, and I have bad news for you. There's a lot of Under Night fans who also play Tekken. And there's a lot of people out there who are just fighting game fans. They like to check out whatever the new release is. And if they have to choose between two options on the same day, they're going to go for the bigger release. But more importantly, as I said, Under Night was still struggling to reach that casual audience. And you know what would have helped with that? If all the big fighting game YouTubers and streamers found themselves thinking, man, there aren't any new games out. What am I gonna talk about? Oh hey, Under Night just came out. I can play that for a few weeks. But instead, all those creators said, oh hey, Tekken is out. I am going to talk about this and only this for the next month. I hate saying this, but there's no other way of putting it. This was a huge missed opportunity by French Bread. So, considering the game that it released against, was Under Night 2 a success? Well, that's hard to say because the sales numbers haven't been shared. The closest I've found is that according to Game Sensors, they sold about 20,000 copies in their first week on Steam, but Game Sensors uses a collection of analytics that they then punch into an algorithm to basically just take a wild guess at the sales, so in other words, that means nothing. Well, we can take a look at the active Steam numbers, and they are rather low. In fact, they're exactly what the numbers were for the last Under Night game right before Under Night 2 release. Which does mean that player base remained consistent, but it also means they didn't bring in many new players. So, what about the tournament scene? Well, in 2019, the EVO numbers for UNIST were 1,100. Really good for a smaller title. But in 2024, the registration numbers for Under Night 2 were just under 800. A definite drop. So yeah, the numbers don't speak highly. Luckily though, success takes many forms. Yes, Steam player numbers are low. But so were the numbers for the other Under Nights, and those numbers still sold well enough for French Bread to keep making this franchise for 10 years. And the registration numbers for EVO dropped, but who said EVO is the only tournament around? Sure, it's the biggest tournament, but Under Night didn't build its audience at EVO. It built it at smaller scenes, in locals, it formed its own community, and it's that community that kept it going throughout all these years. So let's take a look at that specific community. I mentioned that in 2018, in Atlanta, Georgia, a tournament was started all about French Bread games and other anime fighters in the same vein, Climax of Night. Well, in 2022, the last year before Under Night 2 came out, Under Night In Birth EXE Late CLR received almost 200 entries. Then, in 2024, when Under Night 2 released, those numbers jumped to 400. Yeah, it doubled. That's pretty significant. It was the biggest player numbers this tournament had ever seen. And then the next year, for its final show, those numbers jumped again to 500. Yeah, its numbers jumped by another 25% the year after the game came out. That almost never happens. As I said, Climax of Night unfortunately had to come to an end, but it wasn't because of a lack of players.
Y'all may need to... God damn, there's a lot of y'all in here. Look at all them people.
In fact, I say Climax of Night came to an end, but that's not entirely true, because it was so popular, and this player base was so dedicated, that Climax of Night has now been merged into Combo Breaker to get its own dedicated stage and side tournament each year at this event. That's right, the night now lives on because that player base was too strong to die. In fact, speaking of Combo Breaker, let's look at their numbers, and at Frosty Faustines and CE Otaku. Each of these major events hosted Under Night 2 tournaments over the past 2 years, where this tiny indie darling stood side by side with the big boys, coming in the top 5 attendance at each of them. So, I asked, was Under Night 2 a success? And I asked that because recently I've been thinking about that word a lot. There's definitely been a trend I've noticed over the past several years with fighting games aiming for bigger budgets, bigger teams, and as a result, they need to sell higher and higher numbers than ever. And don't get me wrong, that isn't just fighting games. That's the game industry as a whole. But fighting games always used to be a genre that thrived in the cheap. It was a genre where some of the biggest successes didn't have big budgets. Even at the time they were released, a lot of classic fighting games were considered low budget. But now we're seeing a massive explosion in huge fighting games with mountains of cash behind them, which is great. I'm happy to see fighting games gain that kind of attention, but it also feels like there's a narrative that's forming that now your fighting game has to be big and massive to succeed. You have to be one of the big 3, otherwise you're failing. You have to have high player numbers that never drop, otherwise you're a dead game. When budgets get higher, the definition of success is higher too. And because of that, we're seeing fewer games. We're seeing fewer original ideas and original IPs because it's too risky to take that chance. And we're seeing developers who talk about sales goals that are practically impossible to hit for any game, let alone a fighting game, a genre that has always been considered fairly niche. And we're seeing games that are popular and they do have players, but they're still crashing because they can't reach the unobtainable numbers that some AAA studios set for them. And a system like that, no matter how good it looks, is guaranteed to eventually fail. How guaranteed is it? I wrote that line in this script in December of 2025, 2 months before the 2XKO layoffs. Yeah, I'm not a prophet, I'm just someone who understands math. However, Under Night wasn't made with a big team. It wasn't made with a big budget. This game was made by 14 guys in a cave with a box of scraps. It recycled assets. It used whatever tools they had at their disposal. And because of that, success doesn't mean the same thing to this company as it does to a major developer. I mentioned that estimate from Game Sensors, and again, that is just an estimate based on very vague measurements. There is no way in hell it's accurate. So let's say that it is wrong and it didn't sell 20,000 copies in its first week on Steam. Let's say that's how many copies it sold across all platforms. Steam, PlayStation, Switch, everything. If that's true, damn, 20,000 copies across all platforms in its first week? If that was a Capcom game or a Bandai Namco game, they would throw that thing in the vault to never be seen again. Well, good thing French Bread isn't Capcom or Bandai Namco. Yeah, for French Bread, 20,000 copies in its first week is actually pretty decent, and don't take my word for it. In interviews since that game launched, developers from French Bread have said that they've actually been happy with the game's sales. In fact, Sarazawa, in an interview for Evo's YouTube channel, said that Izumi was supposed to be the final update for the game, but they were so impressed with the positive reception that this game got from players that they've started asking those players, hey, what other updates would you like to see? I'm not saying that there's definitely more on the way, but what I am saying is that the sales and reception this game got were enough to make them reconsider ending the game after one season. As I've pointed out several times now, Under Night never really managed to reach that big mainstream audience. But yeah, it turns out you don't need that. Smaller games with smaller audiences can exist, and they can succeed. From day one, French Bread said they wanted to appeal to the more dedicated competitive players, even if they were a smaller audience. And as we saw from those tournament numbers, that audience has been there for them. They've gotten this budget game into the top 5s of major tournaments side by side with games that have 50 times their budget. And they've managed to keep this game going and growing for 10 years now. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it's good that Under Night doesn't sell millions and I want French Bread to stay small. No, not at all. Go buy Under Night. Give these developers money. I don't want them to have to go back to eating convenience store French bread. No, what I'm saying is that in an industry that seems to be pushing a narrative that you can't be a success unless you hit a certain criteria, French Bread has shown for a decade now that's not true. Under Night feels like a throwback to an older era of fighting games, not because it uses sprites or it's wildly experimental, but because it shows that games that are made on a budget, that build up an audience through locals and tournaments and dedicated fans, and games full of original ideas can actually succeed. And that last part is important, because I believe that here at the end of all things, there are two major lessons to take away from Under Night. First, as I just discussed, it is possible for middle ground and budget fighters to find their audience and succeed. But the other lesson of Under Night is, to put simply, keep picking up that pencil, keep creating, keep being original. When I started this retrospective, I didn't expect any grand moral, any big message. I just figured it would be fun to look at this modern day cult classic. But as I read up on French Bread's story, I actually started to get touched. Think about their origin. This was a studio that was formed by friends who grew up wanting to make fighting games and employees whose studio had just shut down and now found themselves without a job. So they said, screw it, we got nothing left to lose, let's follow that dream. And so they spent years making games out of whatever they had access to, selling them at conventions or person to person until finally they got their break with Melty Blood. But then when that game dried up, and nobody wanted to hire them, after all these years of making games based on other people's characters and stories, they decided if nobody was willing to hire them, they were going to make their own game. And think about that line from Narita, where after each of their older original games had failed, he was nervous about Under Night because, quote, we were conditioned to think that original works were synonymous with not selling. Their old attempts to make original games had failed so hard, they didn't think anyone wanted something original from them. And yes, they did change the idea several times over the course of the development, but guess what? That's called the creative process. It happens to all games. What's important is that in the end, they ignored those fears. They pushed ahead and they made their own original game. And now that game has become their most popular hit, revived their company, and been going strong for a decade. And when you look at that, I think that the best thing that you can take away from Under Night is that when times get tough, when you feel lost, keep creating. Keep making your art. Keep being original. And then eventually the darkness will fade, the night will break, and a new day will dawn. Thank you all very much for tuning in for the Under Night in Birth retrospective. It feels very good to get back to doing retrospectives. Yeah, for anybody who is new to this channel, this is the very first video that you check out. We do these retrospectives where we talk about the entire backstory and the making of these fighting games and all the bits of the development and all the story and all that. But about 2 years ago, we did a Street Fighter one, and I thought that was only going to be like 4 parts and maybe take like 6 months, and it was 7, and it took the entire course of 2 years. So it feels good to finally be talking about a brand new game, and I am making you all this promise right now. This is my goal for 2026. I want to get out 4 brand new retrospectives. This is the first one. We got 3 more that we're going to get through. So if you want to see those, then make sure that you click that subscribe button, ring that bell, do all that stuff down there. Give us the thumbs up, leave a comment. Let me know what your thoughts are on Under Night. When did you first find out about Under Night? It's kind of wild when I think about the fact that some random game that I saw in a bar 10 years ago ended up becoming one of my favorite fighters. Yes, leave your comments down there, share these videos around the web. It is the best way to help this channel grow. But you can also support us by joining the Patreon, which is in the description down below, just like all these fine people whose names you are seeing fly up on screen right now. Thank you guys again for tuning in. It will not be nearly as long until our next retrospective goes out. Stay safe out there, everyone, and come back next time.